She came west as a bride, but the man who promised to marry her took one look and walked away, leaving her stranded in a Montana blizzard with nowhere to go. Abandoned, humiliated, alone. The other men circled like wolves until a widowed rancher with a sleeping child stepped forward and changed everything with three simple words: leave her be. This is the story of how a rejected girl found a family she never expected and a love that refused to let her freeze. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The wind that swept across the Billings station platform in January of 1882 wasn't just cold, it was cruel. It cut through fabric and flesh alike, howling through the gaps between the train cars with a sound like something dying. The sky had gone the color of old iron, pregnant with snow that hadn't yet decided to fall, but threatened to bury everything when it did. Lydia Hale sat on a wooden bench that had been worn smooth by countless travelers, though none of them seemed to have lingered as long as she had. Her hands were buried deep in the pockets of a coat that had been adequate in Philadelphia but was laughably insufficient here, where winter meant something entirely different. She could no longer feel her toes inside her button-up boots, and her nose had gone numb an hour ago. She was 18 years old, though she felt ancient. Her carpet bag sat at her feet, holding everything she owned in the world: 3 dresses, a hairbrush with several missing teeth, a small Bible her mother had given her before the fever took her, and the letter. Always the letter. She'd read it so many times the creases had nearly worn through, the words memorized like scripture. Seeking a wife of good character and modest expectations. I am a merchant of comfortable means in Montana Territory. I can offer a home, security, and respect. If you are willing to work hard and desire a new start, I will be a faithful husband. It had been signed Thomas Wardell, and it had seemed like an answer to desperate prayer. Lydia had answered within the day. What choice did she have? Her mother was dead, her father had drunk himself into an early grave 2 years prior, and the boarding house where she'd been working had closed when the owner's son decided the building was worth more as a tobacco shop. She had no family, no prospects, no future in Philadelphia, except the kind that led to streets and back alleys, and the sort of survival that destroyed whatever was left of a girl's soul. So she'd written back with hands that shook, trying to make her penmanship neat, trying to sound like the kind of woman a man might want: modest, hardworking, grateful. She'd included the only photograph she had, a somber portrait from 2 years ago when her mother had insisted before the illness, when there had still been enough money for such things. Thomas Wardell had written back. The arrangement was made. Money for train fare had arrived, 3rd class. But it was enough. She'd packed her bag, said goodbye to the only city she'd ever known, and climbed aboard a train heading west into a future that had to be better than the past she was leaving. The journey had taken 6 days, 6 days of hard wooden seats and stale bread and the constant rocking motion that made her stomach rebel. 6 days of watching the landscape transform from the familiar brick and cobblestone of eastern cities to endless plains that seemed to go on forever, to mountains that rose up like the spine of some impossibly huge creature. She'd imagined what Thomas Wardell might look like. She'd tried not to hope for too much, just kindness, perhaps. Patience. A man who wouldn't raise his hand in anger, who wouldn't come home reeking of whiskey and violence like her father had. A man who might, eventually, come to care for her even a little. She hadn't let herself dream of love. Love was for girls who had choices. The train had arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, wheezing into the station with a great hiss of steam and the screech of brakes. Lydia had gathered her bag and stepped down onto the platform with her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. The platform had been crowded, more crowded than she'd expected for such a remote place. There were cowboys in heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats, their faces weathered by sun and wind. There were a few women bundled in furs, their cheeks red with cold. There were children darting between adults, shrieking with the kind of energy that only children in winter seem to possess. And there, near the station house, had been a man holding a sign. Her heart had leaped. The sign read Wardell in crude letters. She'd approached slowly, clutching her bag, trying to smile despite her nerves. Mr. Wardell? The man had been perhaps 40, with a thick mustache and small, calculating eyes. He'd looked her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl, the same way the boarding house owner's son used to look at her when he thought no one was watching. "You're the bride?" His voice had been flat, unimpressed. "Yes, sir. Lydia Hale. I received your letters, and how old are you?" 18, sir. I'll be 19 in a... You look younger." His eyes had narrowed. "You look like a child." "I assure you, And you're plain." The words had hit her like a slap. She'd stood there, frozen, while the cold wind whipped around them and the crowd moved and shifted like a living thing. "I'm sorry," she'd managed to whisper. "Plain," he'd repeated, as if she might not have heard. "The photograph you sent, it must have been old, or the light was kind. I expected..." He'd waved a hand vaguely. Something more. Shame had flooded through her, hot and poisonous. I don't understand. We had an agreement. Agreement's off." He'd crumpled the sign in his fist. "I'm not spending my life with a girl who looks half-starved and twice as frightened. Go back where you came from." "But Her voice had cracked. "I spent everything I had to come here. I have nowhere to..." "Not my problem." Thomas Wardell had already been turning away. "Should have sent a better picture." And then he'd walked away. Just like that. Walked away through the crowd and disappeared into the town beyond the station, leaving her standing alone with her carpet bag and her useless letter and the growing realization that she had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The crowd had taken notice. Of course they had. This was a small town, and a girl being rejected on the platform was entertainment. "Well, would you look at that?" someone had said, loud enough to carry. Laughter had followed. Poor thing came all this way for nothing. Wardell always was particular. Particular? He's a damn fool. Girl's not that bad. Maybe, but she's not much to look at either. Lydia had wanted to disappear, to melt into the platform or be carried away by the wind. Instead, she'd stumbled back to the bench and sat down, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. What was she going to do? She had 11 cents in her pocket. 11 cents and no return ticket. The train was already pulling away, heading further west, and even if she'd had the money to board it, where would she go? Back to Philadelphia? To what? There was nothing there but memories and closed doors. The light had begun to fade. The crowd had thinned as people headed home to warm fires and hot meals. Lydia had remained on the bench, shivering, trying to think of a plan and coming up empty. That's when she'd noticed them. 3 men standing together near the far end of the platform. They weren't locals, she could tell by the way they held themselves, by the restless energy that marked them as drifters. One of them had been watching her for several minutes now, and when he'd caught her looking back, he'd smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. He'd said something to his companions, and all 3 of them had laughed. Then, as if they'd reached some unspoken agreement, they'd started walking toward her. Lydia's breath had caught in her throat. She'd known that walk, the predatory saunter of men who'd decided a woman was easy prey. She'd seen it in Philadelphia, in the alleys near the boarding house, and she'd always had the sense to run. But there was nowhere to run here. The first man had been tall, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He'd tipped his hat in a mockery of manners. "Evening, miss. Couldn't help but notice you seemed to be in a difficult situation." She'd clutched her bag tighter, saying nothing. "See, my friends and I, we're sympathetic to the plight of a young lady all alone in the cold." His smile had widened, showing teeth stained brown from tobacco. "We'd be happy to offer you shelter, warmth, a place to stay." "No, thank you." Her voice had been barely audible. "Now, don't be hasty." He'd stepped closer, and she'd smelled the whiskey on his breath. "You got no money, no prospects. You can't stay out here all night. You'll freeze. We're offering charity." I said no. She said no, Clay. One of the other men had laughed. "Guess she'd rather freeze." Maybe she doesn't understand how bad things are. The scarred man, Clay, had reached out toward her face. Maybe she needs help understanding. Lydia had jerked back, nearly falling off the bench. "Don't touch me." Friendly little thing, isn't she? "We're just trying to help. Leave her be." The voice had been deep and quiet, but it had cut through the wind and the men's laughter like a blade. Everyone had turned. A man stood 10 feet away, half hidden in the shadows cast by the station house eaves. He was tall taller than Clay, taller than any of the men surrounding her. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat dusted with snow, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. In his arms, bundled in blankets, was a small child with golden hair, fast asleep. Clay had straightened, his expression shifting from amusement to calculation. "This ain't your business, friend. I'm making it my business." The man had stepped forward into the fading light, and Lydia had gotten her first clear look at him. He was perhaps 30, with a face carved by wind and sun and something harder, grief, maybe, or years of labor that left no room for softness. His jaw was shadowed with several days' worth of beard, and his eyes were a startling pale gray, like ice on a winter creek. There was nothing welcoming in those eyes, but there was something solid, something immovable. "Girl's got no one," Clay had said, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "We're offering shelter." "She doesn't want your shelter." The man's gaze had shifted to Lydia. "Do you?" She'd shaken her head frantically. "There you have it." He'd shifted the sleeping child in his arms with the ease of long practice. "Move along." "And who the hell are you to—" "Jonas McKenna." The name had been delivered like a challenge. "I own the Double M Ranch, 15 miles north. You want to make this into something more than talk? We can do that. But I'm armed, sober, and I've got no patience for men who corner women on train platforms." The three drifters had exchanged glances. Whatever they'd seen in Jonas McKenna's face had been enough to make them reconsider. Clay had spat into the snow. "She ain't worth the trouble anyway." "That's what I thought." Jonas hadn't moved, hadn't even raised his voice, but he'd watched until all three men had retreated into the gathering dark, disappearing in the direction of the saloon. Only then had he turned his full attention to Lydia. For a long moment, neither of them had spoken. The child in his arms stirred slightly, making a small sound before settling back into sleep. The snow had finally begun to fall, fat flakes drifting down from the darkening sky. "You the mail-order bride Wardell left?" Jonas had asked finally. Humiliation had burned in her chest, but she'd nodded. "You got anywhere to go?" She'd shaken her head. Jonas had studied her for another moment, his expression unreadable. Then he'd done something she hadn't expected. He'd shrugged out of his heavy coat, carefully so as not to wake the child, and held it out to her. "Put this on." I can't. You're shaking so hard you can barely talk." "Put it on." She'd taken the coat with numb fingers. It was still warm from his body, and it smelled like pine smoke and leather and something indefinably masculine. It swallowed her small frame, but the warmth was immediate and overwhelming. "Here." He'd stepped closer, and before she could protest, had transferred the sleeping child into her arms. "She's warm. Hold her." The little girl couldn't have been more than 4 years old. She had a round face and rosebud lips, and she radiated heat like a small furnace. Instinctively, Lydia had tucked the child close to her chest, and the girl had snuggled in without waking, her small fists clutching at Lydia's dress. It was the first time anyone had touched her with anything resembling trust in longer than she could remember. Her eyes had burned with tears she refused to shed. Jonas had picked up her carpet bag as if it weighed nothing. "You got a name?" "Lydia. Lydia Hale." "Well, Lydia Hale, I'm not leaving you here to freeze or worse. My wagon's around back. You can come to the ranch until you figure out what you're doing next." I don't have any money to pay you. I can work, but we'll figure it out." He'd started walking, clearly expecting her to follow. After a few steps, he'd glanced back. "You coming?" What choice did she have? Lydia had stood clutching the sleeping child close and followed Jonas McKenna into the snow. The wagon had been a simple affair, rough wooden boards and 2 sturdy horses that stamped and blew steam in the cold. Jonas had helped her up onto the seat, taken his daughter back long enough for Lydia to settle, then handed her back. "Keep her warm," he'd said, and that had been all the instruction she'd gotten. He'd climbed up beside her, taken the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses had started forward, and the town of Billings had fallen away behind them. The road north had been little more than a track through the snow. On either side, the land stretched out in rolling waves of white, broken here and there by dark stands of pine. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks lost in clouds. They'd ridden in silence for almost an hour. The only sounds had been the creak of the wagon, the horse's breath, and the wind. Lydia had held the little girl close, absorbing her warmth, too numb with shock and exhaustion to even think clearly. Finally, Jonas had spoken. Her name's Ellie. Lydia had looked down at the child in her arms. She's beautiful. She's all I've got. There had been something raw in his voice that made Lydia glance at him. In the fading light, his profile had been all hard angles, but there had been pain there too. Old pain, worn smooth like a river stone, but never disappearing. Her mother? Lydia had ventured carefully. 2 years gone. Fever. I'm sorry. Jonas had nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head, and said nothing more. They'd ridden on as darkness fell completely. The snow had continued to fall, covering the world in thick silence. Lydia had felt herself beginning to drift, exhaustion and cold combining to make her thoughts fuzzy. She'd jerked awake when Jonas had spoken again. Don't fall asleep. Another 20 minutes. She'd forced her eyes open. I'm fine. You're exhausted. It hadn't been a question. When did you last eat? This morning, bread. He'd grunted, whether in disapproval or acknowledgement she couldn't tell. True to his word, about 20 minutes later, lights had appeared through the snow. The ranch had been small, a cabin made of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney from which smoke rose in a thin stream. There was a barn nearby, and a few other outbuildings whose purposes Lydia couldn't guess in the dark. Jonas had pulled the wagon to a stop near the cabin and climbed down. He'd taken Ellie from Lydia's arms with careful hands, cradling his daughter against his shoulder. Come on. Lydia had climbed down, her legs stiff and clumsy. She'd followed Jonas through the snow to the cabin door. Inside it was warm, blessedly, wonderfully warm. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin was small, one main room that served as kitchen and living space, with what looked like 2 smaller rooms leading off the back. It was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that showed skill, if not artistry. Jonas had carried Ellie to one of the back rooms, and Lydia had heard him moving around, the creak of a bed, his low voice murmuring something too quiet to hear. Then he'd returned, closing the door softly behind him. You can sleep in the grain room. He'd pointed to a door off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. I'm grateful for anything. She'd hesitated. Mr. McKenna, Jonas, I want you to know. I will work for my keep. I can cook and clean and mend. I can help with your daughter. I won't be a burden. He'd looked at her for a long moment, those gray eyes assessing. You know how to work a ranch? No, but I can learn. It's hard work. This isn't the city. I'm not afraid of hard work. Something in his expression had shifted, though she couldn't have said what. We'll see. For now, get some rest. Morning comes early. He'd shown her to the grain room. It was as promised, not much, a small space with a cot, a thin blanket, and a small window. But it was warm, and it was safe, and when Jonas had left her alone and closed the door behind him, Lydia had sunk down onto the cot and finally allowed herself to cry. She'd cried for the life she'd left behind, for the future that had been snatched away on a train platform, for the humiliation and fear and exhaustion. She'd cried until she had nothing left, and then she'd lain down on the cot, pulled the thin blanket over herself, and fallen into a sleep so deep it was like drowning. She'd woken to the smell of bacon. For a moment she'd been disoriented, unable to remember where she was. Then it had all come rushing back. Wardell, the platform, the men, Jonas McKenna, the cabin. Pale morning light had been filtering through the small window. Lydia had sat up, every muscle in her body aching from the journey and the cold. Her dress was wrinkled, her hair had come loose from its pins, and she could only imagine how terrible she must look. Outside the grain room, she'd heard sounds of movement, the clink of metal on metal, a child's voice, high and sweet. Taking a deep breath, Lydia had stood and done her best to make herself presentable. She'd smoothed her dress, tried to tame her hair, and pinched her cheeks to bring some color back into them. Then she'd opened the door and stepped into the main room. Jonas had been at the stove, cooking. He'd changed into a clean shirt but otherwise looked much the same as the night before, tall and solid and entirely too handsome for Lydia's comfort. She'd quickly looked away. Ellie had been sitting at the table, her little legs swinging. When she'd seen Lydia, her eyes had widened. "Papa, the lady's awake!" Jonas had glanced over his shoulder. "Morning." "Good morning." Lydia had clasped her hands in front of her, suddenly uncertain. Should I... Sit. Breakfast's almost ready." She'd sat, and Ellie had immediately scooted closer, staring at her with unconcealed curiosity. "What's your name?" "Lydia." "I'm Ellie. I'm 4.5. She'd held up her hand, fingers spread. "That's almost 5. "That's very grown up," Lydia had said, managing a small smile. "Are you going to live with us?" "Ellie." Jonas's voice had been mild but firm. "Eat your breakfast when I put it down." "But Papa." "Eat first, questions later." Ellie had subsided into silence, though she'd continued to watch Lydia with bright, interested eyes. Jonas had brought plates to the table, bacon, fried eggs, and thick slices of bread toasted over the fire. It was more food than Lydia had seen in days, and her stomach had cramped with hunger at the sight of it. "Eat," Jonas had said, sitting down across from her. She hadn't needed to be told twice. They'd eaten in silence, except for Ellie's chatter, which had been a constant stream of observations about the snow and the chickens and her doll whose arm had come loose and needed fixing. Jonas had answered when appropriate, but otherwise had focused on his food with the single-minded intensity of a man who had work waiting. When the meal was finished, Lydia had immediately stood and started gathering plates. Jonas had watched, but said nothing. She'd washed the dishes in a basin of heated water, dried them, and put them away where she'd seen Jonas take them from. Then she'd wiped down the table and swept the floor, which had accumulated a thin layer of dirt and debris. When she'd finished, she'd turned to find Jonas standing near the door, pulling on his coat. "I've got work in the barn. Ellie, you stay inside where it's warm." "Can Lydia stay with me?" The little girl had looked up hopefully. "If she wants." Ellie had turned her hopeful gaze to Lydia, and Lydia had found herself nodding. "Of course." Jonas had studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "There's mending in the basket by the fire, if you're inclined. And Ellie needs watching. She gets into trouble if you take your eyes off her." "I do not," Ellie had protested. "You put a frog in the butter churn last week." "I wanted to see if he could swim in butter." Despite everything, Lydia had felt a smile tug at her lips. "I'll watch her." Jonas had nodded and left, letting in a blast of cold air before the door shut behind him. For a moment, Lydia and Ellie had simply looked at each other. Then Ellie had grinned. "Do you want to see my doll?" "I would love to." And just like that, Lydia's first morning at the McKenna Ranch had begun. The days that followed had fallen into a rhythm. Jonas had woken before dawn each morning, starting the fire and putting coffee on to boil before he'd headed out to tend to the animals. Lydia had woken soon after, making breakfast and getting Ellie dressed for the day. They'd eat together, Jonas saying little, Ellie chattering enough for all of them, and then Jonas would disappear into the work that seemed endless on a ranch. Lydia had thrown herself into being useful. She'd mended every piece of clothing that needed it, scrubbed the floors until they shone, washed the windows, and reorganized the kitchen to make it more efficient. She'd tended to Ellie with a patience she hadn't known she possessed, playing games and telling stories and listening to the little girl's endless questions about everything under the sun. In the evenings, Jonas would return, silent and exhausted. Lydia would serve dinner, meals she'd managed to cobble together from the supplies in the larder. And afterward, while Jonas sat by the fire cleaning his rifle or mending tack, she would sit with Ellie, helping the girl practice her letters or just holding her while she dozed off. Jonas never said much, but he'd started leaving small things for her, a better blanket for her cot, extra wood for the grain room's small stove. Once, a pair of thick wool socks that he'd carved from the air left on her bed without comment. Lydia hadn't known what to make of him. He was rough and taciturn, a man clearly more comfortable with horses and hard labor than with people, but there was a fundamental decency to him that she'd recognized from that first night on the platform. He'd helped her when he'd had no reason to, asked nothing in return, and treated her with a quiet respect that she wasn't used to. And Ellie was sunshine in human form. The little girl had attached herself to Lydia immediately, following her around the cabin, helping with chores in the way that 4-year-olds helped, which was to say, not very effectively, but with great enthusiasm. She'd chattered constantly, filling the silence with stories about her chickens and her dreams and her mother, who she remembered in fragments. "Mama had yellow hair like me," she'd said one afternoon while Lydia braided her hair, "and she sang pretty. Papa doesn't sing." "Doesn't he?" "He says he sounds like a sick cow." Ellie had giggled. "Do you sing?" "A little." "Will you sing to me?" And Lydia had, soft lullabies her own mother had sung to her once, before the world had gone dark. Ellie had listened with rapt attention, and from across the room, Lydia had felt Jonas's gaze on them, heavy and unreadable. Tja, it had been a week when everything had nearly fallen apart. Lydia had been determined to cook something special, to show Jonas that she was truly earning her keep. She'd found a recipe in an old cookbook on the shelf, beef stew that promised to be hearty and delicious. She'd had the best intentions, but she'd never cooked over an open hearth before. Not really. In the boarding house, there had been a proper stove. Here, controlling the temperature was a matter of instinct and experience, neither of which Lydia possessed. She'd left the pot too close to the flames. The bottom had scorched. Smoke had filled the cabin, acrid and choking. Ellie had started coughing, and Lydia had panicked, yanking the pot off the fire too quickly. Hot liquid had sloshed onto the hearth, hissing and spitting. The door had slammed open, and Jonas had appeared, his face dark with alarm. He'd taken in the scene in an instant, the smoke, the ruined stew. Lydia standing there with tears streaming down her face. What the hell happened? I was trying to cook, and you nearly burned down the cabin." His voice had been harsh, edged with the kind of fear that came out as anger. "You can't just guess at things, Lydia. This isn't a game. You'll burn the place down if you keep—" He'd stopped, seeing her face. But it had been too late. The words had hit her like physical blows. All the fear and uncertainty and shame of the past week had come crashing down, and Lydia had felt herself breaking. She'd fled. Out the door into the snow, stumbling toward the barn because it was the only other building she could see through her tears. She'd collapsed in the hay in an empty stall, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She'd ruined everything. Again. She couldn't even cook a simple stew without destroying it. What use was she? Why had Jonas even bothered to help her? She should leave, should walk away before she caused any more trouble, before he realized what a mistake he'd made. "Lydia?" The voice had been small and uncertain. Lydia had looked up through her tears to see Ellie standing in the barn entrance, barefoot and wearing only her dress despite the cold. "Ellie, you shouldn't be out here. Are you leaving?" The little girl's eyes had been wide and frightened. "Papa yelled, and you ran away. Are you leaving like Mama did?" "Oh, sweetheart, no." Lydia had reached out, and Ellie had run to her, throwing her small arms around Lydia's neck. "Please don't leave. Papa yells a lot, but he doesn't mean to be scary. He's just sad. He's been sad since Mama went to heaven." Lydia had held the child close, feeling her small body shaking. "I'm not leaving, I promise." "You promise?" "I promise." "Good." Ellie had pulled back, sniffling. Then she'd reached into her pocket and pulled out a slightly crumbled cookie. "Papa saved this from yesterday. He said to give it to you and say he's sorry for yelling." Lydia had taken the cookie with shaking hands. "He sent you out here?" "He was going to come, but I ran faster." Ellie had smiled tentatively. "He likes when people stay. He was really sad when Mama couldn't stay." Something in Lydia's chest had cracked open. She'd hugged Ellie again, and they'd sat together in the hay until Jonas had appeared in the barn entrance, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen him before. "Ellie, get back inside. You're not wearing shoes." "I was helping," Ellie had protested, but had scampered off when Jonas had given her a look. Then it had been just the two of them. Jonas had stood there, awkward and massive in the barn doorway. Finally, he'd cleared his throat. "I shouldn't have yelled." "You were right. I was scared." He'd cut her off. "I came in and saw the smoke. And for a second, I thought—" He'd stopped, shaking his head. "I thought maybe I'd lose another person, and I yelled when I should have just taught you the right way." Lydia had stared at him. "Another person?" "My wife, Sarah. She died in this cabin, in that room where Ellie sleeps now. Fever took her fast. I couldn't—" His voice had gone rough. "I couldn't save her. And when I saw that smoke today, I just reacted poorly. I understand." "Do you?" He'd looked at her then, really looked at her, and his eyes had been full of something raw and painful. "You're trying so hard to be useful, to earn your place. You don't have to. You're not a servant here." "Then what am I?" The question had hung between them. Jonas had stepped closer, slowly, as if approaching a spooked horse. Then he'd reached out and, with surprising gentleness, had brushed a piece of hay from her hair. "You're someone who deserves kindness," he'd said quietly. "Someone who deserves to be taught instead of yelled at. Someone who—" He'd stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Someone who's made this house feel less empty." Lydia's breath had caught. "Come back inside," he'd said finally. "It's cold. I'll teach you how to manage the fire properly." And he had. They'd stood together in the kitchen, Jonas showing her how to judge the heat, how to position the pot, how to stir without splashing. His hands had guided hers, large and calloused, and surprisingly gentle. Ellie had watched from the table, eating her cookie and humming a tuneless song. When dinner was finally ready, a second attempt that actually succeeded, they'd sat together, and for the first time, the silence hadn't felt heavy. It had felt almost comfortable. That night, when Lydia had returned to her grain room, she'd found her coat, the one that had torn on the train, lying on her cot. The seam had been carefully stitched with small, precise stitches. No note, no explanation, just the coat, mended and returned. She'd held it to her chest and cried again, but this time the tears had been different. This time they'd been relief. The days began to blur together in a way that wasn't unpleasant. Lydia found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with a growing sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. Each morning brought new tasks, new challenges, and slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she belonged somewhere after all. She learned to read the weather by the way the horses shifted in their stalls, restless before a storm. She learned which hens were broody and which would peck your hand if you reached for their eggs too quickly. She learned that Jonas took his coffee black and scalding hot, that Ellie refused to eat carrots unless they were cut into stars, and that the cabin's back door stuck in the morning and needed a firm shove to open. Jonas taught her about the fire, about cooking over open flame, about the endless small skills required to survive a Montana winter. He was patient in a way that surprised her, his big hands guiding hers as he showed her how to bank the coals at night so the fire would last until morning, how to season the cast iron properly, how to knead bread dough until it had just the right elasticity. "Like this," he'd say, his voice low and steady. "Feel how it pushes back? That's when you know it's ready." And Lydia would feel the dough beneath her palms, warm and alive, and she'd understand. Ellie was her constant shadow, chattering away as Lydia worked. The little girl helped fold laundry, badly, and set the table, enthusiastically, and swept the floor, creating more mess than she cleaned. But her presence filled the cabin with light and laughter, and Lydia found herself looking forward to each day just to see what Ellie would say or do next. "Why is snow white?" Ellie had asked one morning while they were making breakfast. Well, I suppose because that's the color ice makes when it freezes in tiny pieces." "But why isn't it blue like the sky?" "I don't know, sweetheart. That's a very good question. Papa says I ask too many questions." Lydia had smiled, cracking eggs into a bowl. "I think your papa is very smart, but I don't think there's such a thing as too many questions." "Really? Really? Questions are how we learn." Ellie had beamed at that, and for the rest of the day her questions had multiplied exponentially. By evening, Jonas had given Lydia a look that was half exasperation, half amusement. "You've created a monster," he'd said. "An educated monster," Lydia had countered, and she'd caught the ghost of a smile on his face before he'd turned away. 2 weeks after the stew incident, a new problem arose. The cabin's main room, which served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once, had grown cluttered with the accumulated debris of winter life. Muddy boots by the door, coats hung on every available hook, tools that Jonas had brought in to repair by firelight and then forgotten. Lydia had surveyed the mess one morning after Jonas had left for the barn and made a decision. She would organize, properly organize, create a system that would make the space more livable for all of them. She'd started by moving furniture, dragging the heavy wooden bench away from the wall to sweep behind it. That's when she'd found the trunk. It was a beautiful piece, despite being covered in dust. Cedar wood with brass fittings, the kind of trunk that spoke of care and craftsmanship. Lydia had hesitated, knowing she shouldn't pry into Jonas's private things, but curiosity had won out. Just a quick look, she'd told herself, just to see if it was empty and could be used for storage. She'd lifted the lid. Inside, carefully folded and preserved, were women's things. Dresses and soft fabrics, a hairbrush with golden strands still caught in the bristles, a small jewelry box containing a simple wedding ring. At the bottom, wrapped in cloth, was a daguerreotype in a silver frame. Lydia had lifted it with shaking hands. The woman in the photograph had been beautiful. Delicate features, fair hair, a smile that seemed to dance even in the frozen moment of the image. She held a baby in her arms, Ellie, clearly, though much younger. The woman's eyes had been full of joy and life and hope. This was Sarah, Jonas's wife, Ellie's mother. "What are you doing?" Lydia had spun around, nearly dropping the photograph. Jonas stood in the doorway, and his face had gone pale, then dark with something that looked like pain and anger mixed together. "I'm sorry, I was cleaning, and I found the trunk, and I shouldn't have—" "No, you shouldn't have." His voice had been flat, emotionless in a way that was somehow worse than anger. He'd crossed the room in 3 long strides and taken the photograph from her hands. "This was private. I know. I'm so sorry. I wasn't trying to—" "Wasn't trying to what? Pry into things that don't concern you?" He'd placed the photograph back in the trunk with careful hands, but his jaw had been tight. "This is my wife. Was my wife. These are her things. I understand. Do you?" He'd turned to face her, and the raw grief in his eyes had stolen her breath. "Do you understand what it's like to lose someone? To have them there one day and gone the next? To keep their things because letting go feels like losing them all over again?" Lydia had flinched. "Yes," she'd whispered. "I do." That had stopped him. He'd stared at her, some of the anger draining away, replaced by exhaustion. "My mother," Lydia had continued quietly, 2 years ago, fever, like your wife. And my father, he drank himself to death after she was gone. So yes, I understand loss. I understand keeping things that belong to people who aren't coming back. I understand that emptiness." Jonas had been silent for a long moment. Finally, he'd closed the trunk lid gently. "I'm sorry for your loss. And I'm sorry for invading your privacy. I truly was just cleaning. I didn't mean to cause you pain." He'd nodded slowly, then looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "Place is a mess, isn't it? I was trying to help with that." "I know." He'd run a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration or weariness or both. "I should have put that trunk away properly, should have moved it to the attic. I just couldn't bring myself to." "You don't have to explain." "Maybe I do." He'd sat down heavily on the bench, his broad shoulders slumping. "It's been 2 years, and some days I still expect to hear her voice, still turn around thinking she'll be there, keeping her things close. It helps, even if it probably shouldn't." Lydia had understood that more than she could say. She still had her mother's Bible, still opened it sometimes just to see the familiar handwriting in the margins, still pressed her face against the pages, hoping to catch some lingering scent of lavender and home. "There's no right way to grieve," she'd said softly. "Isn't there?" Jonas had looked up at her. "Everyone in town thinks I should have moved on by now, that I should find a new wife, give Ellie a proper mother. They don't understand that I can't just replace her. I don't think anyone is replaceable." Something in his expression had shifted. "No, they're not." They'd stood there in the quiet cabin, 2 people bound by loss and loneliness, and for a moment, understanding had passed between them without words. Then Ellie had burst through the door, covered in snow and giggling. "Papa! Lydia! Come look! The chickens made footprints everywhere and it looks like dancing. The spell had broken. Jonas had stood, the moment passing. Better go see these dancing chickens. Jonas, Lydia had called as he'd moved toward the door. He'd paused. The trunk can stay where it is. I'll clean around it. He'd looked back at her, and something in his eyes had been soft. Thank you. After that day, something changed between them. Not dramatically. Jonas was still quiet, still kept his thoughts close. But the silences felt different. Less like walls and more like comfortable pauses in an ongoing conversation. He started talking more at dinner, telling Lydia about the ranch work, asking her opinion on small matters. She learned that he was worried about one of the horses who'd gone lame, that he was planning to buy more cattle in the spring, that he'd built this cabin himself over the course of 2 summers. You built this whole place yourself? Lydia had asked, amazed. With some help from neighbors for the roof, but mostly, yes. He'd looked around the room with something like pride. Sarah drew the plans. She wanted a big kitchen, lots of light. That's why the windows are larger than most cabins out here. She had good instincts. It's a wonderful space. He'd paused, choosing his words carefully. She was good at making places feel like home. That was her gift. I built the structure, but she made it somewhere worth living. Lydia had heard what he wasn't saying, that since Sarah's death, the cabin had been just a structure again, that it had taken Lydia's presence, Lydia's efforts to clean and organize and care for things, to make it start feeling like a home once more. The thought had been both flattering and terrifying. One afternoon, while Jonas was out checking fence lines and Ellie was napping, Lydia had decided to tackle the laundry. It was a massive undertaking, weeks' worth of clothes and linens that had piled up because Jonas simply didn't have time to keep up with it properly. She'd hauled water, heated it over the fire, and scrubbed until her hands were raw and red. The work was hard but satisfying, and she'd hung the clean laundry on lines strung across the cabin's main room, creating a maze of drying fabric. She'd been taking down a dry sheet when she'd heard a sound from outside. Not Jonas's familiar heavy tread, but something else. Voices. Multiple voices. Lydia had gone to the window and peered out. 3 women were approaching the cabin, bundled in furs and good wool, their faces curious and not entirely friendly. Her stomach had dropped. She knew what this was. The town women, come to inspect the strange girl living at the McKenna Ranch. She'd barely had time to smooth her dress and check her hair before the knock came. Taking a deep breath, Lydia had opened the door. "Good afternoon," the oldest of the 3 women had said. She was perhaps 50, with sharp eyes and a sharper smile. "You must be the girl from the train station. I'm Mrs. Hartley. This is Mrs. Cooper and Miss Shaw. We've come to call on Jonas, but it seems he's not home." "He's working," Lydia had said, acutely aware of how she must look. Hands still red from washing, dress damp and wrinkled, hair escaping its pins. "Would you like to come in? I can make tea." "How generous," Mrs. Cooper had said, though her tone suggested anything but generosity. She was younger than Mrs. Hartley, but twice as pinched, with a mouth like she'd been sucking lemons. "We won't impose long." They'd filed into the cabin, and Lydia had felt their eyes cataloging everything, the clean floors, the organized shelves, the laundry hanging everywhere, the visible signs of her presence. "You've been busy," Miss Shaw had observed. She was close to Lydia's age, but dressed far better with a fur-trimmed cloak and leather gloves. "The place looks different. I've been trying to help," Lydia had said, putting the kettle on. "Jonas has been very kind to give me shelter." "Kind?" Mrs. Hartley had repeated the word as if tasting it. "Yes, Jonas is known for his kindness. Tell me, dear, what exactly is your arrangement here?" Lydia had frozen. "My arrangement?" "You're living in his house, unchaperoned, with his child." Mrs. Cooper's eyebrows had risen. "Surely you can see how that looks." "I sleep in the grain room," Lydia had said, heat rising in her cheeks. "I help with housework and with Ellie, that's all." "That's all?" Mrs. Hartley had smiled, and it hadn't reached her eyes. "You're not his employee." "I'm not." Lydia had struggled to find the right words. "I'm someone he helped when I had nowhere else to go." "How charitable." Miss Shaw had walked around the room, touching things. The clean dishes, the folded linens, the child's toys arranged neatly in a basket. Though I'm sure the town would be more comfortable if the situation were formalized. Formalized? Made proper, Mrs. Cooper had clarified. A marriage, perhaps, or at least a formal employment contract. As it stands, you're living in sin. I am not, Lydia had started, indignant, but Mrs. Hartley had held up a hand. We're not here to judge, dear. We're here out of concern. For Jonas, for little Ellie, and for you. This territory can be harsh on a woman's reputation. I'm not concerned about my reputation. Perhaps you should be. Miss Shaw had turned to face her fully, and there had been something almost predatory in her smile. Jonas is a good man, a prosperous man. There are several women in town who had hoped, well, let's just say your presence here has caused some disappointment. The implication had been clear. These women, or at least Miss Shaw, had set their sights on Jonas as a potential husband, and Lydia, living in his house, was an obstacle. I think you should leave, Lydia had said quietly. Excuse me? I think you should leave. She'd straightened her spine, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. You came here under the pretense of a social call, but really you're here to gossip and to make me feel small. Jonas offered me shelter when I was desperate, and I won't apologize for accepting his kindness, and I certainly won't justify myself to women who don't even know me. Mrs. Hartley's eyes had widened. Well, I see you have some spine after all. I have a great deal of spine, Mrs. Hartley. I've had to develop it. For a moment, the three women had simply stared at her. Then, surprisingly, Mrs. Hartley had laughed. Good for you, girl. The territory eats up weak women. Maybe you'll survive after all. They'd left shortly after, their tea undrunk, and Lydia had watched them go with shaking hands and a racing heart. When Jonas had returned that evening, she told him about the visit. He'd listened with a darkening expression, his jaw tight. They had no right, he'd said finally. They were protecting what they see as their interests. They were being busybodies and bullies. He'd looked at her directly. Did they upset you? They tried to, but they didn't succeed? Lydia had managed a small smile. I told them to leave. Good. Jonas had set his hat on its hook with more force than necessary. Damn town gossips, as if I don't have enough to worry about without them sticking their noses in. Jonas, they raised a point, though, about my situation here, about appearances. Let them think what they want. But what about Ellie? What about your reputation? He'd turned to look at her, and his expression had been fierce. My reputation is my own concern. Ellie is happy, happier than she's been since her mother died. And you have nowhere else to go. Is that still true? Yes. Then you stay. To hell with what the town thinks. His vehemence had surprised her, warmed her. Thank you. Nothing to thank me for. But his voice had gentled. You've earned your place here 10 times over, Lydia. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. That night, as Lydia had lain in her small room, she'd thought about his words, about earning her place, about the strange little family that was forming here, built not on blood or obligation, but on mutual need and growing respect. It wasn't what she'd imagined when she'd boarded that train west. But maybe, just maybe, it was something better. The next morning had dawned bright and cold. Lydia had woken to find that the water in the basin had frozen overnight despite the stove. Winter was tightening its grip. Jonas had decided it was time to teach Ellie, and by extension, Lydia, about the animals. They'd bundled up in their warmest clothes and trudged out to the barn through knee-deep snow. Inside, the barn had been dim and surprisingly warm, heated by the bodies of the horses and the 2 cows Jonas kept for milk and butter. The smell had been strong, hay and manure and animal warmth, but not unpleasant. This is steady, Jonas had said, leading them to a large bay mare with kind eyes. She's getting on in years, but she's reliable, good with children. Ellie had reached up to stroke the horse's nose, fearless. Hi, Steady, you're pretty. And this is her daughter, Storm. Jonas had moved to the next stall, where a younger mare with a white blaze stood. She's got her mother's temperament, thank God. Some horses are flighty, but these 2 are solid. He'd gone through all the animals, the gelding he used for heavy work, the cows, the dozen or so chickens that roosted in one corner, even the barn cat who appeared and disappeared like a ghost. You need to check on them every day, he'd explained. Make sure they have water that hasn't frozen, that they're eating, that there's no injury or illness. Animals are like children. They can't tell you when something's wrong, so you have to learn to read the signs. Lydia had watched, fascinated, as he demonstrated how to check a horse's hooves for stones or cracks, how to feel along their legs for heat or swelling, how to judge whether a cow was healthy by the look of her coat and the brightness of her eyes. "Can I learn to ride?" Ellie had asked, bouncing with excitement. "When you're bigger," Jonas had said, "maybe in the spring." "That's what you always say." "That's because you keep asking before you're big enough." He'd swung her up onto his shoulders, making her squeal with delight. "Be patient, little one." Watching them together, Jonas so gentle with his daughter, Ellie so trusting in her father's strength, had made Lydia's chest ache with something she couldn't quite name. This was what family looked like. This was what love looked like in its simplest and purest form. "Lydia, come here." Jonas had called her over to one of the cows' stalls. "I'm going to teach you to milk. It's not difficult, but it takes practice." He'd shown her how to sit on the small stool, how to grip the teat, how to pull and squeeze in a rhythm that coaxed the milk into the pail below. His hands had covered hers, guiding her movements, his presence solid and warm behind her. "Like this," he'd murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Steady pressure, steady rhythm. The cow will let you know if you're doing it wrong." Lydia had tried to focus on the cow, on the technique, on anything except the fact that Jonas was so close she could feel his heartbeat against her back. Her hands had shaken, and the milk had sprayed everywhere except into the pail. Jonas had chuckled, a low rumble she felt more than heard. "Takes time. Try again." It had taken a dozen attempts before she'd managed to get a decent stream going, and by then, her hands had been cramping and her cheeks had been burning from a combination of cold and embarrassment and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. "There," Jonas had said when she'd finally filled half the pail. "See? You're a natural." "I'm terrible at it." "You're learning. That's different." He'd stood, taking the pail from her. "Sarah couldn't milk to save her life. Used to joke that the cows were laughing at her." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife in a way that was fond rather than painful, and Lydia had recognized it for the gift it was. He was beginning to heal, to remember the joy instead of just the loss. "I'll practice," she'd promised, "every day until I get it right." "I know you will." They'd returned to the cabin to find that the bread Lydia had left rising had overflowed the bowl and was now dripping onto the table. She'd gasped in dismay, but Ellie had found it hilarious, and even Jonas had smiled as they'd cleaned up the mess. "Guess I still have a lot to learn about baking, too," Lydia had said ruefully. "We'll add it to the list," Jonas had replied, and there had been something in his voice, warmth maybe, or acceptance, that had made her think maybe mistakes were allowed here. Maybe she didn't have to be perfect to deserve her place. That evening, after Ellie had gone to bed, Lydia had sat by the fire mending socks while Jonas worked on a broken harness at the table. The silence between them had been comfortable, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional whisper of thread through wool. "Those women who came yesterday," Jonas had said suddenly, "what they said about formalizing the arrangement, they weren't entirely wrong." Lydia's needle had stilled. "What do you mean?" "I mean that having you here, without any clear understanding of what you are to this household, it's not fair to you. If something happened to me, you'd have no legal standing. No way to stay here, no claim to anything. I don't expect—" "I know you don't, but I need to think about these things." He'd set down the harness, his expression serious. "I could hire you formally, put you on as a housekeeper, pay you wages." "I don't need wages." "Everyone needs wages, Lydia. You can't live on gratitude and goodwill forever." She'd known he was right, but the idea of being paid to do what she'd been doing out of, what? Necessity? Gratitude? Something else? It had felt wrong somehow. "Can we talk about this later?" she'd asked finally. "When I've had time to think?" "Of course." He'd returned to his work, but Lydia had felt his gaze on her throughout the rest of the evening, heavy with thoughts unspoken. She'd lain awake late into the night, listening to the wind howl around the cabin and thinking about what Jonas had said, about legalities and arrangements and the future that stretched out before them, uncertain and strange. She'd come west to be a wife and had ended up being, what? A housekeeper? A caretaker? A friend? She'd been all those things and none of them, existing in some undefined space that was both comfortable and precarious. And what did she want? The question had circled her mind like a hawk. What did she want from this strange new life she'd stumbled into? She'd wanted safety, once, security, a place to belong. And she had that, didn't she? Here, in this rough cabin with a taciturn rancher and his bright-spirited daughter, she'd found something that felt remarkably like home. But was it enough? Could it be enough? The questions had followed her into uneasy sleep, and she dreamed of trains and snow and a little girl with golden hair asking, "Will you stay?" In her dream, Lydia had answered yes. When she'd woken, she'd found herself wondering if that answer was true in waking life too. The morning had brought fresh snow, and with it, new challenges. One of the chickens had escaped somehow and was running loose in the yard, squawking indignantly. Ellie had thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen and had tried to catch it, resulting in both child and chicken covered in snow and equally outraged. Jonas had captured the bird with practiced ease, and Lydia had tried not to laugh at the sight of him holding the indignant hen while Ellie peppered him with questions about where the chicken had been trying to go. Maybe she wanted an adventure, Ellie had suggested. Or maybe she's just stupid, Jonas had replied, returning the bird to the coop. Some creatures don't know when they've got it good. His eyes had met Lydia's over Ellie's head, and she'd felt the weight of meaning there. Was he talking about the chicken, or about something else entirely? The day had continued in its usual pattern, chores and lessons and the 1,000 small tasks that made up ranch life. But underneath it all, Lydia had felt a current of change building, like pressure before a storm. Something was shifting. Between her and Jonas, between her and this place, between who she'd been and who she was becoming. She'd been running from a future in Philadelphia that had terrified her. But maybe, just maybe, she was running towards something here, something that felt like hope. That hope proved fragile when the rumors reached a fever pitch 3 days later. Lydia had gone into town with Jonas to pick up supplies, her first trip back to Billings since that terrible day on the platform. She'd been nervous about returning, about facing the place where she'd been so publicly humiliated, but Jonas had insisted she needed proper winter boots and a heavier coat. "Can't have you freezing to death because you're too proud to accept help," he'd said gruffly, and she hadn't had the heart to argue. The general store had been warm and crowded, smelling of coffee and tobacco and the peculiar mix of goods that characterize such places. The proprietor, Mr. Jennings, had greeted Jonas with familiarity and Lydia with barely concealed curiosity. "This the girl staying out at your place?" he'd asked, weighing out nails on a brass scale. "She is," Jonas had replied, his tone making it clear the topic was closed, but Mr. Jennings hadn't taken the hint. "Must be nice having help around the house, especially with a little one to look after." "It is. Of course, people talk. You know how it is in a small town." Jonas's jaw had tightened. "People should mind their own business." "Now, Jonas, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. A young woman living out there with you, no chaperone, no formal arrangement. Folks wonder about the propriety of it." "Then folks can wonder all they want." Jonas had placed money on the counter with more force than necessary. "We'll take those boots, the lined ones, and a heavy wool coat, women's sizes." While Mr. Jennings had fetched the items, Lydia had become aware of other customers watching them. 2 women by the fabric counter were whispering behind their hands. An older man near the door was frowning in obvious disapproval. A younger woman, Miss Shaw from the other day, was staring at Lydia with undisguised hostility. She'd felt her face flush hot with shame. They were all thinking it, all judging her. The rejected bride who'd somehow managed to trap a decent man into an improper situation. "Here we are," Mr. Jennings had returned with the boots and coat. "That'll be $7 even." It had been a fortune. Lydia had opened her mouth to protest, to say she couldn't possibly accept such expensive items, but Jonas had already been counting out bills. "Jonas, that's too much," she'd started. "It's Montana winter. You need proper gear." He'd handed her the coat. Try it on, make sure it fits. She'd slipped into the coat under the watchful eyes of every person in the store. It had been beautiful, thick wool lined with flannel, with deep pockets and toggles made of horn. It fit perfectly, hanging to mid-calf and wrapping her in immediate warmth. It's wonderful, she'd whispered, but I can't. You can and you will. Jonas had picked up the boots. These too, and don't argue. I won't have you catching your death because you're stubborn. The ride back to the ranch had been tense. Jonas had been silent, his hands tight on the reins, while Lydia had sat wrapped in her new coat, feeling the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Finally, she'd spoken. They think I'm your mistress. Jonas had flinched. They think whatever gossip is most entertaining. But it's not just gossip, is it? It's what they believe. What they'll keep believing as long as I'm living in your house without being what? My wife? He'd said it bluntly, and Lydia had felt her breath catch. Is that what you think I should do? Marry you to satisfy the gossips? No, I didn't mean because I won't. His voice had been hard. I won't marry again, Lydia. I can't. She was everything. And I'm not looking to replace her with some arrangement of convenience just to make the town busybodies happy. The words had stung worse than any slap. Lydia had turned away, staring blindly at the passing snow. I understand. Do you? Yes. You loved your wife. You still love your wife. And I'm just someone who happened to need help at the right time. Or the wrong time, depending on how you look at it. Jonas had been quiet for so long she'd thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice had been softer. That's not what I meant. It's what you said. I said I won't marry again. That doesn't mean you're nothing to me. You're good with Ellie. Good for her. And the house. He'd struggled for words. The house feels different now. Better. I'm grateful for that. Grateful. The word had sat between them like a stone. I should leave, Lydia had said quietly. I should find somewhere else to go. I'm causing you problems, damaging your reputation. Where would you go? Jonas had pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. Back to Philadelphia? To what? You told me yourself there's nothing there for you. There's nothing here either, apparently. Just gossip and judgment and... There's Ellie. He'd cut her off. There's my daughter, who hasn't laughed this much since her mother died. Who follows you around like a duckling, who talks about you constantly, who started calling you. He'd stopped, shaking his head. Started calling me what? Nothing. Forget it. But Lydia had seen something in his face, something that made her heart race. Jonas, what does she call me? He'd looked away, his jaw working. Sometimes, when she's half asleep, she calls you Mama, just slips out. And I don't correct her because she looks so damn happy when she says it. Lydia had felt tears prick her eyes. Oh. So no, you're not leaving, not unless you truly want to, and even then... He'd picked up the reins again. Even then I'd try to talk you out of it. They'd ridden the rest of the way in silence, but it had been different than before. Charged with things unsaid, with emotions neither of them knew how to name. When they'd arrived back at the ranch, Ellie had burst out of the cabin wearing Jonas's too large coat and her nightgown, clearly having dressed in a hurry. Her face had been flushed, her eyes bright with excitement. Lydia! Papa! Guess what? Ellie, what are you doing outside without proper clothes? Jonas had climbed down from the wagon. And who's watching you? Nobody. I'm watching myself. I'm a big girl. She'd grabbed Lydia's hand the moment she'd descended. But guess what? The cat had babies. In the barn. 5 of them. The barn cat? Jonas had frowned. I didn't even know she was expecting. Come see! Come see! Ellie had been practically vibrating with excitement. They'd all trudged to the barn, where, sure enough, in a nest of hay in one of the empty stalls, the gray barn cat had given birth to 5 tiny kittens. They were perhaps a day old, still blind and mewling, piled together for warmth while their mother watched with wary green eyes. Oh, Lydia had breathed, kneeling carefully nearby. They're beautiful. Can we keep them? Can we? Please? Ellie had bounced on her toes. I'll take care of them and feed them and teach them everything. The mother will take care of them for now, Jonas had said, but his voice had been gentle. But yes, we can keep them. They'll be good barn cats. And one can be a house cat. Please, Papa, just one. We'll see. Lydia had watched the tiny creatures, their miniature paws kneading the air, their small mouths opening in soundless mews. There was something about new life, about these fragile beings fighting to survive in the harsh Montana winter, that made her throat tight with emotion. They're lucky, she'd murmured, to have a warm place, a mother who'll protect them. Jonas had crouched beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Everyone deserves that. A safe place. Someone to protect them. She'd looked at him and found him already watching her, those pale eyes intense. For a moment, the barn had fallen away, and there had been just the two of them, something unspoken crackling in the air between them. Then Ellie had squealed as one of the kittens moved, and the moment had shattered. That night, after Ellie had finally been convinced to come inside and go to bed, after no less than 3 trips back to the barn to check on the kittens, Lydia had sat by the fire trying to make sense of the day, of the town's judgment, of Jonas's words, of her own confused feelings. She'd been so lost in thought that she hadn't heard him approach until he spoke. I need to apologize. She'd looked up to find Jonas standing nearby, his hat in his hands, his expression troubled. For what? For what I said earlier, about not marrying again. It came out wrong. You were being honest. I was being a coward. He'd sat down in the chair across from her, setting his hat on the table. Sarah's death, it broke something in me. For a long time, I didn't care about anything except getting through each day for Ellie's sake. And then you showed up, and suddenly the house wasn't so empty anymore. Suddenly, there was someone who made Ellie laugh, who made meals that tasted like someone cared, who folded the laundry and mended the clothes and made everything feel less what? Less hopeless. He'd rubbed his face with both hands. But that scares me, Lydia, because caring about someone means you can lose them, and I don't know if I can survive that again. Lydia had felt her heart crack open. Jonas, I'm not asking you to fix me. I'm not asking you for anything, really. I just wanted you to understand. When I said I wouldn't marry again, it wasn't because you're not. It wasn't a reflection on you. It's my own fear talking. I understand fear, she'd said softly. I've been afraid every day since my mother died. Afraid of being alone, of starving, of ending up on the streets, of being unwanted and unloved, of being exactly what Thomas Wardell saw when he looked at me on that platform. Too young, too plain, too nothing. You're not nothing. Jonas's voice had been fierce. You're brave and kind and stronger than you know. Any man who couldn't see that is a fool. The words had warmed her from the inside out. Thank you. It's just the truth. They'd sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Lydia had spoken again. I don't need marriage, Jonas. I don't need promises or papers or anything formal. I just need to know that I'm not making your life harder, that my being here is worth the gossip and the judgment. It is. God help me. It is. Something in his tone had made her look up sharply, but his face had been in shadow, unreadable. Then I'll stay, she'd said, for as long as you'll have me, and we'll let the town think whatever they want to think. To hell with the town. To hell with the town, she'd agreed, and for the first time since they'd returned from Billings, she'd felt the knot in her chest begin to loosen. The next few days had passed in relative peace. The weather had turned bitter, keeping them all inside more than usual. Lydia had taught Ellie to make paper snowflakes, and they'd hung them in the windows where they caught the weak winter sun. Jonas had worked on building new shelves for the kitchen, measuring and sawing while Ellie peppered him with questions and Lydia prepared meals. It had felt like playing house, like pretending at being a family. And the strange thing was, it hadn't felt strange at all. But the peace couldn't last. It never did. On the 4th day after their trip to town, Lydia had woken in the pre-dawn darkness to the sound of Ellie coughing. At first she'd thought nothing of it. Children coughed. It was winter. These things happened. But something about the sound had pulled her from her bed, and she'd padded quietly into the main room. Jonas had already been there, standing outside Ellie's door with a lamp in his hand, his face etched with worry. How long has she been coughing? Lydia had whispered. Started about an hour ago. I thought it would pass, but another cough, wet and rattling, had come from behind the door. It's getting worse. Lydia had pushed past him and into Ellie's room. The little girl had been tossing in her bed, her face flushed even in the dim lamplight, her breathing labored. Ellie, sweetheart. Lydia had placed a hand on the child's forehead and jerked back at the heat. Jonas, she's burning up. He'd been at the bedside in an instant, his face going pale as he'd felt his daughter's fever. No, not again. The fear in his voice had been visceral, primal. This was how Sarah had started, Lydia had realized, with a fever, with labored breathing. I'm riding to town for the doctor, Jonas had said, already moving toward the door. No. Lydia had caught his arm. Look outside. Through the window, visible in the gray light of approaching dawn, snow had been falling so thick it looked like a solid wall of white. The wind had been howling like a living thing, rattling the shutters and whistling through every crack. I don't care about the weather, Jonas had started. You'll die out there. Lydia had gripped his arm harder. You won't make it a mile in this, and then what? Ellie needs you here. We need you here. But the doctor, we'll have to manage without him. She'd turned back to Ellie, her mind racing. My mother was sick for months before she died. I learned some things. Not much, but some things. What if it's not enough? What if it is? She'd met his eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there. We have to try, Jonas. We stay. We fight. For a long moment, he'd stood frozen, torn between action and paralysis. Then he'd nodded slowly. Tell me what to do. Lydia had taken charge with a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. We need to keep her fever down. Bring me every piece of clean cloth we have and fill the basin with cool water. Not cold, cool. We'll make compresses. Jonas had moved immediately, grateful for concrete tasks. Throughout the long day that followed, they'd worked together to keep Ellie alive. Lydia had bathed the child's burning skin with cool cloths, had coaxed her to drink water and weak tea, had propped her up when the coughing got so bad it seemed like she couldn't breathe. Jonas had paced and prayed and held his daughter's hand, whispering things Lydia couldn't hear. Mama, Ellie had whimpered at one point, her eyes unfocused with fever. Mama, it hurts. I know, baby. Lydia had smoothed the girl's sweat-dampened hair. I know it hurts, but you're going to be okay. You hear me? You're going to be just fine. Promise? I promise. Lydia had blinked back tears, knowing she had no right to make such a promise, but making it anyway. Jonas had looked at her over Ellie's small form, and in his eyes, she'd seen gratitude and terror in equal measure. As evening fell and the storm continued its assault on the cabin, Ellie's breathing had grown worse. She'd started making a horrible wheezing sound, fighting for every breath, her small chest heaving with effort. Steam, Lydia had said suddenly. We need steam. It'll help open her lungs. They'd hung wet cloths near the fire and brought Ellie out in a nest of blankets, setting her as close to the steam as was safe. Lydia had held her, rocking gently, singing every lullaby she could remember while Jonas kept the fire going and the cloths damp. Hours had passed. The storm had raged. And slowly, so slowly, Ellie's breathing had begun to ease. By midnight, the fever had broken. Ellie had opened her eyes, clearer now, and looked up at Lydia with confusion. Why are you crying? The little girl had whispered. Lydia had laughed through her tears, hugging the child close. Because I'm happy, sweetheart. Because you're going to be okay. I was sick? Very sick, but you're better now. Did you make me better? We all did. Your papa and me. Ellie had looked around until she'd spotted Jonas, collapsed in his chair with his head in his hands. Papa. He'd looked up, and when he'd seen his daughter awake and lucid, something in his face had crumpled. He'd crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered both Ellie and Lydia into his arms, holding them so tight Lydia could barely breathe. Thank God, he'd breathed. Thank God. They'd stayed like that for a long time, the 3 of them wrapped together while the storm howled outside and the fire crackled warm. And Lydia had felt something shift deep in her chest, some final wall crumbling. This was her family, not by blood or law, but by choice, by the thousand small moments that had led them here, to this night, to this embrace. Eventually, Jonas had carried Ellie back to her bed, tucking her in with gentle hands. The little girl had been asleep before her head hit the pillow, exhausted but safe. Jonas and Lydia had returned to the main room, neither speaking, both too wrung out for words. Lydia had collapsed into the rocking chair, suddenly aware of how tired she was, how much the night had taken from her. Jonas had knelt before her chair, his hands covering hers. "You saved her life," he'd said hoarsely. "We saved her life." "No, you did. I was ready to ride out into that storm like a madman. I would have died, and then she would have died too. You kept us both alive." "Jonas, let me say this." His grip on her hands had tightened. "I told you I couldn't marry again, that I wouldn't. But seeing you tonight, watching you fight for my daughter like she was your own, I realized something." Lydia's heart had been hammering so hard she'd thought it might burst from her chest. "What?" "That I'm already gone. That somewhere between that platform and tonight, you stopped being the girl I helped and became—" He'd paused, seeming to search for words. "You became necessary, essential, and I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything, but I want to." He'd looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I want to give you everything you came west for. Security, safety, a home, a family. I want to give you my name and my protection and everything I have. Jonas, I'm not saying I love you. Not yet. I don't know if I can, if there's still room in my heart after Sarah. But I care about you more than is probably wise. And I want you to stay, not as a housekeeper or a favor, but as my wife, if you'll have me." Lydia had stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. This was what she'd come west for, wasn't it? A proposal, a future, security. But it wasn't, not really. She'd come west desperate and afraid, willing to marry a stranger just to survive. But Jonas wasn't a stranger anymore. He was the man who'd saved her, who'd given her shelter, who'd taught her patience and shown her kindness. He was the father of a little girl who called her mama in her sleep. And she didn't want to marry him just for security. She wanted to marry him because when she looked at him, she felt something warm and terrifying blooming in her chest, something that felt dangerously like love. "Ask me again in the morning," she'd whispered, "when we're not exhausted and afraid. When the storm is past, ask me again and I'll give you my answer." Jonas had studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "In the morning, then." He'd stood, helping her to her feet, and for a moment they'd simply looked at each other. Then, with a tenderness that made her breath catch, he'd leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Sleep well, Lydia." "You too, Jonas." She'd gone to her small room and lain down on her cot, still fully dressed, too tired to even remove her boots. Through the thin wall, she'd heard Jonas checking on Ellie one more time, heard the creak of his own bed as he finally lay down. The storm had continued outside, but inside the cabin, all was quiet, safe, warm. And Lydia had fallen asleep with tears on her cheeks and a smile on her lips, thinking of morning and the question that would come with it. When she'd woken, it had been to silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. Through her small window, she'd seen snow piled nearly to the sill, glittering in bright morning sun. She'd risen and dressed carefully, braiding her hair and pinching color into her cheeks. Her hands had been shaking. In the main room, Jonas had already been awake, making coffee. He'd looked up when she'd entered, and something in his expression had made her heart skip. "Ellie?" she'd asked. "Still sleeping. Fever's gone. She's going to be fine." "Good. That's good." They'd stood there, awkward as strangers, until finally Jonas had set down his coffee cup and crossed the room to stand before her. "I meant what I said last night." "I know. And I'm asking now, in the light of day, with a clear head." He'd taken her hands in his. "Lydia Hale, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and a mother to Ellie and share this life with me for whatever it's worth?" Lydia had looked up into his face, at the lines carved by wind and worry, at the gray eyes that had seen so much loss but still held hope. She'd thought about all the reasons she should say yes: security, safety, a home, a family, all the practical things. But what came out was the truth. I'll marry you, Jonas McKenna, not because I need you to save me, but because I want to. Because somewhere in the last few weeks, this cabin became home, and Ellie became my heart, and you became... She'd smiled through sudden tears. You became the best thing I never knew I was looking for. Jonas had let out a breath he seemed to have been holding forever. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he'd cupped her face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her. It had been gentle, tentative, the kiss of two people learning each other. But it had been real, and it had been right, and when they'd pulled apart, Lydia had felt like she could finally breathe. When? He'd asked. When what? When should we marry? There's a circuit preacher who comes through once a month. He'll be here in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, then? You're sure? You're not feeling rushed, or... I'm sure. And she had been. More sure than she'd been of anything in her life. A small sound had made them both turn. Ellie stood in the doorway of her room, looking small and pale, but blessedly alive. Papa, she'd said sleepily. Lydia? What's happening? Jonas had scooped his daughter up, holding her close. We're getting married, little one. Lydia's going to be your new mama. Is that okay with you? Ellie had pulled back to look at Lydia with wide, wondering eyes. Really? You're going to be my mama? Forever? Forever, Lydia had promised, moving to join them. If that's what you want. Yes! Ellie had thrown her thin arms around Lydia's neck. Yes, yes, yes. I've been wishing and wishing for a mama, and now you're going to be mine. And there, in the warm cabin with snow piled high outside and sunlight streaming through the windows, the three of them had held each other and laughed and cried. A family not born but made, forged in Montana winter, and sealed with promises that mattered more than any legal document. Later, after Ellie had been settled back in bed with warm broth and fresh water, Jonas had found Lydia at the kitchen window, staring out at the brilliant white world. Having second thoughts? He'd asked quietly. No, just thinking about how strange life is. How I came here expecting one thing and found something completely different, something better. No regrets? She'd turned to face him, this man who'd shown her that kindness still existed, that hope wasn't foolish, that love, even love that grew slowly, carefully, in the frozen ground, was possible. No regrets, she'd said firmly, not a single one. And she'd meant it with every fiber of her being. The 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. The storm that had trapped them had been the last major snowfall of the season, and though the cold remained fierce, the roads became passable again. Word spread quickly through the territory that Jonas McKenna was finally remarrying, and the news was met with reactions ranging from genuine happiness to thinly veiled disappointment. Lydia had expected the gossip to intensify, but she hadn't expected Mrs. Hartley to appear at the cabin door 3 days after the engagement with a basket on her arm and a determined expression on her face. May I come in? The older woman had asked, though she was already stepping over the threshold before Lydia could answer. Of course. Lydia had stepped back, wiping flour from her hands. She'd been attempting to bake bread again, with mixed results. Mrs. Hartley had set her basket on the table and surveyed the cabin with sharp eyes that missed nothing. So it's true then, Jonas proposed. He did. And you accepted. I did. Well, Mrs. Hartley had removed her gloves with precise movements. I came to apologize for my behavior when I visited before. I was testing you, if I'm being honest, trying to see what kind of woman you were, whether you'd run at the first sign of trouble or stand your ground. Lydia had been taken aback by the admission. I see. You stood your ground, told us to leave, as I recall. That took courage. The older woman had smiled, and this time it had reached her eyes. Jonas needs a woman with spine. This territory eats up the weak ones. So you've said. And I meant it, which is why I'm here. Mrs. Hartley had opened her basket and pulled out a dress wrapped in muslin. This was my wedding dress, 40 years ago. I've kept it all this time, thinking maybe I'd have a daughter to pass it to, but I had 4 boys instead, rough creatures, every one of them. She'd unwrapped the dress carefully, and Lydia had gasped. It was beautiful, cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Simple, but elegant. I couldn't possibly, Lydia had started. You can and you will. Every bride deserves a proper dress, and I doubt you brought one with you from Philadelphia. Mrs. Hartley had held the dress up to Lydia, assessing. We're about the same height. It might need taking in at the waist, but nothing I can't manage. Why are you doing this? Lydia had asked, bewildered by the kindness. Because Jonas is a good man who's suffered enough, and because you saved his daughter's life during that storm. Yes, I heard about it. News travels fast in small towns. Mrs. Hartley had folded the dress carefully and set it on the table. And because every woman deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day, no matter the circumstances that brought her there. Tears had pricked Lydia's eyes. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Say you'll come to town for a fitting tomorrow, and bring that little girl. She'll need something nice to wear, too. After Mrs. Hartley had left, Lydia had held the dress up to herself and looked at her reflection in the small mirror by the door. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she'd allowed herself to believe that maybe this was real, that maybe she deserved happiness after all. That evening, when she told Jonas about Mrs. Hartley's visit, he'd looked surprised. She brought you her wedding dress? She did. I think she's decided to approve of me. That's a relief. Martha Hartley runs half the town through sheer force of will. Having her on your side is worth more than gold. I'm starting to realize that. Jonas had reached across the table and taken her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Are you nervous? About the wedding? A little. Are you? Terrified, he'd admitted with a rueful smile. I didn't think I'd ever do this again. Stand up in front of people and make promises. After Sarah, I thought that part of my life was over. We don't have to have a big ceremony. It could just be us and Ellie and the preacher. No. He'd squeezed her hand. You deserve a real wedding, witnesses and celebration and all of it. Besides, Ellie's already told half the territory that she's getting a new mama. If we tried to keep it quiet now, she'd never forgive us. It was true. Ellie had been practically vibrating with excitement since they'd told her the news. She'd drawn pictures of the three of them as a family, had practiced saying "mama" over and over until the word had lost all strangeness, had asked at least 100 questions about what would happen at the wedding. Will there be cake? She'd asked at breakfast that morning. There will be cake, Lydia had promised. And will you wear a pretty dress? The prettiest dress I've ever worn. And will Papa kiss you? Jonas had choked on his coffee, and Lydia had felt her cheeks flame red. That's generally what happens at weddings, yes, she'd managed to say. Good. Ellie had nodded decisively. Because that's how you know it's real. That's what Mama told me about her and Papa's wedding. She said the kiss made it magic. The mention of Sarah had made the table fall silent. Then Jonas had reached over and ruffled his daughter's hair. Your mama was right. The kiss does make it magic. Then you have to kiss Lydia really good, Ellie had instructed seriously, so it's the most magic it can be. Despite the awkwardness, both Jonas and Lydia had laughed. And later, when Ellie had gone outside to check on the kittens, Jonas had pulled Lydia close and kissed her gently. Practice, he'd murmured against her lips. Want to make sure I get it right on the day. She'd kissed him back. And in that moment, with his arms around her and the winter sun streaming through the windows, she'd felt more at home than she ever had in Philadelphia. The trip to town for the dress fitting had been an adventure. Ellie had been beside herself with excitement, chattering nonstop about the wedding and the kittens and the fact that spring would be coming soon and everything would be green and beautiful. Mrs. Hartley's shop, for she ran a small dressmaking business out of the back of her house, had been warm and crowded with bolts of fabric and half-finished garments. The older woman had greeted them with brisk efficiency. Lydia, behind the screen with you. Ellie, you can help me pick out fabric for your dress. What's your favorite color, child? Yellow, like sunshine, like Mama's hair. Lydia had caught Jonas's expression. A flicker of pain quickly smoothed away, and had felt her heart ache for him. He was trying so hard to move forward, but the past kept reaching for him with ghostly hands. Behind the screen, Lydia had stripped down to her chemise and allowed Mrs. Hartley to help her into the wedding dress. It had fit remarkably well, though it had needed some adjustments. You're thinner than I was, Mrs. Hartley had said, her mouth full of pins as she'd marked the alterations. "We'll take it in here and shorten the hem a bit. You're not quite as tall as I was either." "It's beautiful," Lydia had breathed, looking at herself in the full-length mirror. The dress transformed her, made her look like someone worthy of being a bride, someone worthy of Jonas and Ellie and the life they were offering. "Beauty comes from within," Mrs. Hartley had said, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "But a good dress doesn't hurt. Now, let's see about your hair. Have you thought about how you'll wear it?" They'd spent the next hour discussing wedding details, and Lydia had been surprised by how much she enjoyed it. In Philadelphia, she'd had no one to share such things with. But here, Mrs. Hartley had taken on the role of surrogate mother, offering advice and stories about her own wedding day and the early years of her marriage. "It won't always be easy," the older woman had said as she'd helped Lydia out of the dress. "Marriage is work, especially out here where life is hard. But Jonas is a good man, steady, and you're stronger than you look. You'll make it work." "I hope so. I know so." Mrs. Hartley had wrapped the dress carefully. "I'll have this ready in a week. And Ellie's dress too. We found a lovely yellow fabric that she's convinced will make her look like a princess." When they'd emerged from behind the screen, Ellie had been sitting on Jonas's lap, showing him a piece of yellow cloth and explaining in great detail how her dress would look. "And it'll have ribbons here and buttons here and maybe some lace if Mrs. Hartley thinks that's okay." "I think that's more than okay," Mrs. Hartley had interjected. "I think that's perfect." The ride home had been peaceful, all three of them content in their own thoughts. But as they'd approached the ranch, they'd seen something that made Jonas pull the wagon to a stop. There was a horse tied to the rail outside the cabin. A stranger's horse. "Stay here," Jonas had said, his voice suddenly tense. He'd climbed down and approached the cabin cautiously. But before he'd reached the door, it had opened, and a man had stepped out. He was perhaps Jonas's age, dressed in travel-worn clothes, with a face that looked vaguely familiar, though Lydia couldn't place where she'd seen it before. "Jonas McKenna?" the man had called out. "Who's asking?" "Name's Samuel Wardell, Thomas Wardell's brother." Lydia's blood had run cold. Wardell. The man who'd rejected her on the platform. The man whose cruelty had started this whole chain of events. Jonas had gone very still. "What do you want?" "I heard about what my brother did, how he treated this young lady." Samuel Wardell had gestured toward the wagon where Lydia sat frozen. "I came to apologize on his behalf and to make amends if I can." "Your brother's an ass," Jonas had said bluntly, "and if you're anything like him, you can get back on that horse and I'm nothing like him." Samuel had held up his hands peacefully. "Thomas is my brother, but he's also a prideful fool. What he did was wrong, cruel. And when I heard that Miss Hale had found a place here, that you were planning to marry her, I felt I should come and, well, I wanted to meet her, to apologize properly." Jonas had looked back at the wagon, his expression asking a silent question. Lydia had climbed down slowly, her legs shaking, and had approached with Ellie's small hand gripped tightly in hers. Samuel Wardell had removed his hat when he'd seen her, his expression genuinely remorseful. "Miss Hale, I can't tell you how sorry I am for what my brother did. I gave him a piece of my mind when I heard, but I know that's little comfort." "Why are you here?" Lydia had asked, her voice steadier than she'd felt. "To apologize, as I said, and to—" He'd reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "Thomas sent you west on false pretenses. The least I can do is return your train fare. It's not much, but it's something." He'd held out the envelope, but Lydia hadn't moved to take it. "I don't want his money." "It's not his. It's mine. Consider it an apology gift." When she still hadn't moved, he'd set the envelope on the porch rail. "I'll leave it here. Use it or burn it. That's up to you. But please know that not all Wardells are heartless." "I appreciate the gesture," Jonas had said, his voice still cool. "But Miss Hale is about to become Mrs. McKenna. She's got no need for apologies from the past." Samuel had smiled slightly. "I can see that. And I can see she's found a far better man than my brother could ever be." He'd nodded to Lydia. "I wish you all the happiness in the world, ma'am. You deserve it." He'd mounted his horse and ridden away, leaving the three of them standing in the cold. Jonas had picked up the envelope and handed it to Lydia. Your choice what to do with this. She'd opened it to find $50, more than double what the train fare had cost. It was a small fortune. I could use this for the wedding, she'd said slowly. Buy food for a celebration. Make it nice for everyone. Or you could keep it for yourself. You've earned the right to do whatever you want with it. Lydia had looked at the money, then at Jonas and Ellie, then back at the money, and suddenly she'd known exactly what to do with it. I want to buy chickens, she'd said. Jonas had blinked. Chickens? More chickens. A whole flock of them. We can sell the eggs in town, build up a little income. It'll be mine to manage, mine to build into something. I don't want to just be someone you take care of, Jonas. I want to contribute, to build something of my own here. For a moment, Jonas had just stared at her. Then he'd laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that had made Ellie giggle too. Chickens it is, he'd said, though you're going to have to build a bigger coop. We'll build it together, she'd replied, and had meant it in every possible way. The week before the wedding, more visitors had arrived. Neighbors from surrounding ranches, people Lydia had never met, all coming to offer congratulations and satisfy their curiosity about the mail-order bride who'd captured Jonas McKenna's heart. Most had been kind. A few had been skeptical, but all had been won over by Ellie, who'd greeted everyone with enthusiastic announcements that she was getting a mama. And wasn't that the most wonderful thing in the whole world? One visitor had surprised Lydia more than any other. Miss Shaw had appeared at the door carrying a small package, her expression uncomfortable. May I speak with you? She'd asked. Alone? They'd walked out to the barn, away from the cabin and curious ears. Miss Shaw had been silent for a long moment before speaking. I need to apologize, she'd said finally. When I came here before with Mrs. Hartley and Mrs. Cooper, I wasn't kind. I was jealous and petty, and I said things I shouldn't have. You were honest about your feelings. I was cruel. Miss Shaw had looked at her directly. I'd had my eye on Jonas for over a year, since before his wife died, if I'm being completely honest. And when you arrived, when I saw how he looked at you, even in those early days, I knew I'd lost something I'd never really had. I didn't come here to steal anyone, Lydia had said quietly. I know that now, and I can see that you're good for him. For both of them. Miss Shaw had held out the package. This is for you, a wedding gift, peace offering, whatever you want to call it. Inside had been a beautiful lace handkerchief, delicately embroidered with flowers. It's lovely, Lydia had breathed. It was my grandmother's. I'd planned to carry it at my own wedding, but Miss Shaw had shrugged. I think you should have it. Something borrowed or something old or whatever the tradition is. Thank you, truly. Can I give you some advice? Miss Shaw had asked. Woman to woman? Of course. Don't try to be Sarah. Don't try to fill her shoes or be the wife she was. Be yourself. That's who Jonas fell for, whether he realizes it yet or not. The words had stayed with Lydia long after Miss Shaw had left. She'd looked down at the handkerchief, at the intricate stitching that represented hours of work, and had felt the weight of what she was about to do. She was marrying a man who'd loved another woman deeply, completely, a man who kept his late wife's trunk in the main room because he couldn't bear to put it away. Could she live with that? Could she build a marriage in the shadow of a ghost? That night she'd found Jonas in the barn, checking on the horses before bed. She'd wrapped herself in her heavy coat and joined him, the air between them frosting with their breath. Can I ask you something? She'd said. Always. Do you still love her, Sarah? Jonas had gone still, his hand frozen on the horse's flank. Yes, he'd said finally, I do. Not the way I did when she was alive, but yes, I still love her. Will you always? Probably. He'd turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight. Does that bother you? I don't know, Lydia had admitted. Part of me thinks it should. That I should want to be your one and only love, the way girls dream about. But another part of me thinks your capacity to love someone even after they're gone, to keep that memory alive, it says something about the kind of man you are. What does it say? That you're loyal, that you honor your promises, that love matters to you. She'd stepped closer. And if you can love her even now, maybe someday you'll be able to love me too. Jonas had cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. I already do, Lydia. Maybe not the same way I loved Sarah. Nothing will ever be the same as your first love. But what I feel for you, it's real. It's deep. And it's growing stronger every day. Even though I burn stew and can barely milk a cow and ask too many questions, especially because of all those things. He'd kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips, gentle, sweet kisses that had made her toes curl in her boots. You're not a replacement for what I lost. You're something entirely new, something I didn't know I needed. I'm scared, she'd whispered. So am I. What if I'm not enough? What if you're already enough? You've been enough since the day I found you on that platform. He'd pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. We're going to be fine, Lydia. More than fine. We're going to build something good here. And standing in the warm barn with snow falling softly outside and Jonas's heartbeat steady under her ear, Lydia had believed him. The day before the wedding, the cabin had been chaos. Mrs. Hartley had arrived early with the finished dresses, followed by several other women from town who'd insisted on helping prepare food for the celebration. The small cabin had been packed with people cooking and laughing and offering advice that ranged from helpful to mortifying. Jonas had fled to the barn with Ellie, claiming he needed to repair a fence that absolutely could not wait one more day. Coward, Mrs. Hartley had called after him, but she'd been smiling. Lydia had been scrubbing potatoes when Mrs. Cooper had sidled up to her, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Has anyone talked to you about the wedding night, dear? Lydia's hands had stilled. No, I thought not. You've got that innocent look about you. Mrs. Cooper had patted her hand. Don't worry, it's perfectly natural. A bit uncomfortable the first time, but Jonas seems like a considerate man. Just remember to— Margaret! Mrs. Hartley had interrupted, her face red. The girl doesn't need your advice on that particular matter. She needs someone's advice. Unless you think she should go in blind. She'll figure it out. Mrs. Hartley had turned to Lydia, her expression softening. Jonas will be gentle with you, dear, and if you need any advice after, well, any of us are happy to help. Lydia had wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She'd known, in theory, what happened between a husband and wife, but the reality of it, the fact that tomorrow night she and Jonas would share a bed, would be intimate in ways she could barely imagine. It terrified and excited her in equal measure. That evening, after everyone had left and Ellie had been put to bed, Jonas had found Lydia sitting on the porch despite the cold, staring out at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow, he'd said simply. Tomorrow. Having doubts? No, just thinking. He'd sat beside her, their shoulders touching. What about? Everything. How different my life is from what I expected. How a month ago I was on a train heading toward one future, and now I'm about to step into a completely different one. Better or worse? She'd looked at him, at this man who'd saved her without expecting anything in return, who'd given her a home and a purpose and the chance to be something more than a cast-off. Better. So much better. Good. He'd taken her hand, lacing their fingers together. Because I meant what I said before. About feeling lucky to have you here. About caring for you. I want you to know that tomorrow, when I make those vows, I'll mean every word. So will I. They'd sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead until the cold had driven them inside. At the door to her small room, her last night sleeping there before she moved into Jonas's room, into the space that had once belonged to Sarah, Jonas had stopped her with a hand on her arm. Thank you, he'd said. For what? For saying yes, for taking a chance on a gruff widower and his talkative daughter, for making this house feel like a home again. He'd kissed her, slow and sweet. I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you don't regret it. I could never regret you, Jonas McKenna. And as she'd lain in her narrow cot for the last time, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling around her, Lydia had felt a peace she'd never known. Tomorrow she'd become a wife, a mother, a partner in building a life that was wild and difficult and more beautiful than anything she'd imagined. The rejected bride was about to become something far better, chosen, cherished home. Dawn broke clear and cold on Lydia's wedding day, painting the snow-covered world in shades of pink and gold. She'd barely slept, her mind too full of anticipation and nervousness to settle into rest. When she finally rose and dressed in her everyday clothes, the wedding dress would come later, her hands were shaking. Mrs. Hartley arrived at first light with 3 other women in tow, their arms full of supplies and their faces bright with the excitement of a wedding. They descended on the cabin like a benevolent storm, shooing Jonas out to the barn and taking over every surface with flowers they'd somehow preserved from summer, ribbons, and enough food to feed half the territory. "Come here, child," Mrs. Hartley had commanded, pulling Lydia into the grain room that had been her home for these past weeks. "Let's make you beautiful." "I don't know if beautiful is possible," Lydia had said nervously, looking at her reflection in the small hand mirror Mrs. Hartley had brought. "Nonsense. You've got good bones and clear skin and the kind of eyes that show everything you're feeling. That's better than beauty. That's honesty." The older woman had begun unpinning Lydia's braid. "Now, tell me, are you frightened?" "Terrified." "Good. Only fools walk into marriage without some fear. It's a big thing, binding your life to another person's. But Jonas is worth the fear, I think." "I know he is." Mrs. Hartley had worked in silence for a moment, running a brush through Lydia's hair with gentle strokes. "My husband died 3 years ago," she'd said quietly. "Heart gave out while he was plowing the south field. Dropped dead right there in the furrow." "I'm so sorry." "Don't be. We had 42 good years together, raised 4 sons, built a life, loved each other through good times and bad." She'd met Lydia's eyes in the mirror. "That's what I want you to understand. Marriage isn't about perfection. It's not about being madly in love every single day. It's about showing up, about choosing each other even when it's hard, about building something together that's bigger than either of you alone." "I want that," Lydia had whispered, "more than anything." "Then you'll have it. Now let's make you look like the bride you are." Over the next hour, Mrs. Hartley had transformed Lydia. She'd arranged her hair in a soft style that made her look older, more elegant. She'd pinched Lydia's cheeks to bring color to them and dabbed a tiny bit of rose oil behind her ears. And then finally, she'd helped Lydia into the wedding dress. The cream silk had whispered as it settled over Lydia's frame, and the lace had felt delicate as snowflakes against her skin. Mrs. Hartley had fastened the tiny buttons up the back with practiced fingers, then stepped back to assess her work. "Oh, my dear girl," she'd breathed, "you're lovely." Lydia had turned to look at herself in the full-length mirror that had been brought from Mrs. Hartley's house, and she'd barely recognized the woman looking back. The dress fit perfectly, highlighting a figure she'd always thought too thin. Her hair gleamed in the lamplight, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She looked like a bride, a real bride. Not someone desperate and discarded, but someone worthy of love and promises in a future. "I wish my mother could see this," she'd whispered. Mrs. Hartley had wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "She can, child. Wherever she is, she can see you, and she's proud. I'm sure of it." A knock at the door had interrupted them. Ellie's voice had called out, "Can I come in? Is Lydia ready? Papa says the preacher's here and everyone's waiting, and I want to see." "Come in, little one," Mrs. Hartley had called. The door had burst open and Ellie had rushed in, then stopped dead. Her mouth had fallen open as she'd stared at Lydia. "You look like a princess," the little girl had breathed. "A real princess from a storybook." "You look pretty beautiful yourself," Lydia had said, taking in Ellie's yellow dress with its ribbons and lace. Ellie had twirled, making the skirt flare out. "Mrs. Hartley made it just like I wanted. And look, I have flowers for my hair, too." She'd pointed to the small crown of dried flowers perched on her golden curls. "You're the prettiest girl in all of Montana." "After you," Ellie had corrected. "Today you're the prettiest because you're the bride. Tomorrow we can both be pretty together." She'd reached out and taken Lydia's hand. "Are you ready to marry Papa?" "I am." "Are you ready to have me as your mama?" "I've been ready forever," Ellie had said seriously. "Since the very first night when you held me and kept me warm. I knew then that you were supposed to be my mama." Lydia had blinked back tears, not wanting to ruin the careful work Mrs. Hartley had done on her face. "Then let's go make it official." The ceremony was to be held in the cabin, as was customary in winter when the weather made travel to a church impossible. When Lydia emerged from her room, she'd been stunned by how many people had crowded into the small space. Neighbors from ranches miles away, townspeople she barely knew, all pressed together and smiling as she appeared. And there, at the front of the room near the fireplace, stood Jonas. He'd cleaned up in a way she'd never seen before. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair combed back, and he wore a suit that must have been his wedding suit from his marriage to Sarah, dark wool that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. But it was his face that had stopped her heart. The way he'd looked at her, eyes wide and full of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. The circuit preacher, Reverend Walsh, was an older man with kind eyes and a voice that carried despite his small stature. He gestured for Lydia to come forward, and she'd walk through the crowd with Ellie holding her hand and Mrs. Hartley following behind. When she'd reached Jonas's side, he'd taken her hand and squeezed gently. "You're beautiful," he'd whispered, for her ears only. "You're not so bad yourself." Reverend Walsh had cleared his throat, a gentle reminder that they had an audience. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jonas McKenna and Lydia Hale in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, with love and commitment." The Reverend had continued with the traditional words, but Lydia had barely heard them. She'd been too focused on Jonas, on the way he'd held her hands, on the intensity in his eyes that spoke of promises deeper than any words could convey. "Jonas McKenna," Reverend Walsh had said, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do." Jonas's voice had been clear and strong, ringing through the cabin. "I do, and I will." "And do you, Lydia Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Lydia had looked at Jonas, at this man who'd saved her life in more ways than one, who'd given her a home and a purpose and a family, and she'd felt certainty fill her like sunlight. "I do, with all my heart I do." "The rings?" Reverend Walsh had asked. Jonas had pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, nothing fancy, just a plain circle of metal that gleamed in the firelight. He'd slipped it onto Lydia's finger with hands that shook slightly. "With this ring I thee wed," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. Lydia had produced her own ring. She'd used part of Samuel Wardell's money to buy it in town, a matching band for Jonas. She'd slid it onto his finger, marveling at how right it looked there. "With this ring I thee wed," she'd echoed. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana and the grace of God, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Walsh had smiled broadly. "Jonas, you may kiss your bride." For a heartbeat, they'd simply stood there, staring at each other. Then Jonas had cupped Lydia's face in his hands, gentle despite his size, and had kissed her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. The kiss had been sweet and slow and full of promise. It had tasted of hope and new beginnings, of love that grew slowly but ran deep. And when they'd finally pulled apart, the cabin had erupted in cheers and applause. Ellie had thrown herself at both of them, wrapping her small arms around their legs. "You did it! You're married! Now we're a real family!" "We've always been a real family," Jonas had said, scooping his daughter up. "Now we're just making it official." The celebration that followed had been joyous and chaotic. There had been music, someone had brought a fiddle, and dancing, though the space had been so cramped that it had been more like swaying in place. There had been food in abundance, dishes brought by every family present, from roasted chicken to fresh bread to pies made with preserved fruit. Mrs. Cooper had produced an actual wedding cake, a small miracle of flour and sugar and patience, decorated with candied flowers. When Jonas and Lydia had cut the first slice together, Ellie had bounced on her toes with excitement. "Make a wish," she'd instructed. "That's what you do at weddings." I don't need to wish," Lydia had said, looking around at the crowded cabin, at the faces of people who'd become friends, at her new husband and daughter. "I have everything I could ever want." As the afternoon had worn into evening, People had begun to leave, heading back to their own ranches before dark fell completely. Each one had offered congratulations and well wishes, and several women had whispered advice to Lydia that had made her blush scarlet. Finally, as the last guests had departed and the sun had begun to set, it had been just the three of them again. Jonas, Lydia, and Ellie, standing in a cabin that smelled of food and flowers and happiness. "I'm tired," Ellie had announced, yawning widely. "Can I go to bed now?" "After you help clean up," Jonas had said, but his tone had been gentle. They'd worked together to restore order to the cabin, washing dishes and putting away food, and sweeping up the debris of celebration. It had been comfortable, domestic, the three of them moving around each other with the easy familiarity of people who belong together. When Ellie had finally been tucked into bed, her eyes already closing before Lydia had finished pulling up the blankets, Jonas had caught Lydia's hand as she'd left the child's room. "Wait," he'd said quietly. They'd stood in the doorway, looking back at the sleeping child. In the lamplight, Ellie had looked impossibly small and vulnerable, her golden hair spread across the pillow, one hand clutching the doll Lydia had repaired weeks ago. "She's happy," Jonas had murmured. "Happier than she's been since Sarah died. That's because of you." "That's because of us," Lydia had corrected. "We're doing this together." Jonas had pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "I was so scared," he'd admitted quietly. "After Sarah died, I was terrified that Ellie would grow up without knowing what a mother's love felt like, that she'd be raised by a father who was too broken to give her everything she needed." "You're not broken, Jonas." "I was. I am. But you're helping me heal, helping both of us heal." He'd turned her in his arms so they were facing each other. "I know I said I wasn't sure I could love again, that my heart might not have room after Sarah, but I was wrong." Lydia's breath had caught in her throat. "I love you, Lydia McKenna. Not the same way I loved Sarah. It's different, new, its own thing, but it's real, it's deep, and it's not going away." He'd kissed her forehead. "I'm in love with you, and I probably have been since the night you fought to save Ellie's life. Maybe even before that." Tears had spilled down Lydia's cheeks. "I love you too. I think I started loving you the moment you put your coat around my shoulders and told those men to leave me alone. When you showed me that kindness still existed in the world." "Then we're both lucky," Jonas had said, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "Against all odds, we found each other." He'd led her to his room, their room now, and they'd stood at the threshold for a moment. It was a simple space, furnished with a large bed covered in a quilt, a dresser, and a chair by the window. Personal items that had belonged to Sarah had been carefully removed, Lydia noticed. Jonas had made this space ready for her, for them, for their new life together. "Are you nervous?" he'd asked softly. "Yes." "Are you?" "Terrified," he'd admitted with a small smile. "It's been a long time, and I want this to be good for you. I want everything to be good for you." Lydia had reached up and touched his face, feeling the scratch of his beard against her palm. "Then it will be, because we're together, and that makes everything right." What followed had been tender and awkward and beautiful. Jonas had been gentle with her, patient, taking his time despite her nervousness. He'd whispered reassurances and promises against her skin, had held her as if she might break, had made her feel cherished in ways she'd never imagined possible. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in the darkness, Lydia had felt a completeness she'd never known. This was intimacy. This was trust. This was love in its most vulnerable, honest form. "Thank you," Jonas had murmured against her hair. "For what?" "For taking a chance on me. On us. For being brave enough to stay when you could have run." "Where else would I go?" Lydia had snuggled closer. "This is home. Your home." They'd fallen asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time since her mother's death, Lydia had slept without nightmares, without fear, just peace and warmth and the steady rhythm of her husband's heartbeat. The weeks that followed the wedding had brought a new rhythm to life on the ranch. Winter slowly loosened its grip, and with the first hints of spring came new possibilities. Lydia had thrown herself into her chicken project with determination, using Samuel Wardell's money to purchase 24 laying hens and a proud rooster who crowed at ungodly hours of the morning. Jonas had helped her build a proper coop, the two of them working side by side in the lengthening days, teaching each other as they went. He'd shown her how to measure and cut wood, how to make joints that would hold. She'd shown him how to create nesting boxes that the hens actually liked, learned from observation and trial and error. "You're a natural at this," Jonas had said one afternoon, watching her coax a particularly stubborn hen into the new coop. "I'm learning. There's a difference." "Is there?" He'd smiled, and she'd noticed he smiled more now. The grief that had shadowed his features had begun to lift, replaced by something lighter. Hope, maybe. Or just contentment. Ellie had been ecstatic about the chickens, naming each one and insisting they all had distinct personalities. She'd helped collect eggs every morning, her small basket always full, her chatter constant. "This one is Marigold and she's bossy," Ellie had explained one day. "And that one is Snowflake even though she's brown because I like the name. And that one is Grumpy because she pecks at everyone." The eggs had sold well in town, and Lydia had felt a fierce pride in earning money through her own effort. It wasn't much, but it was hers, proof that she could contribute, that she had value beyond just keeping house and caring for Ellie. Jonas had noticed. "You're good at this," he'd said one evening as she'd counted the week's earnings, building something from nothing. "I had a good teacher." She'd smiled at him. "You did the same thing with this ranch." "That was different. I had capital, experience. You had determination and courage, same as me." She'd reached across the table and taken his hand. "We're more alike than you think, Jonas McKenna." "I'm starting to see that." As spring truly arrived, the ranch had exploded with activity. Calves were born, requiring round-the-clock attention. The fields needed plowing and planting. Fences needed repair after the harsh winter. Jonas had worked from dawn until well past dark most days, and Lydia had worried about him pushing himself too hard. But she'd also seen the pride in his eyes when he'd surveyed his growing herd, the satisfaction in his face when the first green shoots had appeared in the planted fields. This land was his legacy, what he'd built for Ellie's future, and he'd poured his heart into every acre. Lydia had helped where she could, learning to milk the cows with increasing proficiency, helping with the planting, keeping the house running smoothly so Jonas had one less thing to worry about. And in the evenings, when he'd stumbled in exhausted, she'd have a hot meal waiting and a warm smile, little comforts that mattered more than grand gestures. One night in late April, as they'd lain in bed with the window open to catch the spring breeze, Lydia had felt Jonas's hand drift to her stomach with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Do you think—" he'd started, then stopped. "Think what?" "That maybe someday there might be another child in this house? A brother or sister for Ellie?" Lydia had felt her heart swell. "I'd like that. Would you?" "I'd like it very much." He'd pulled her closer. "I know it's soon, and there's no rush, but the thought of you carrying our child, of watching you become a mother in that way too, it makes me happy." "Then we'll hope," Lydia had said softly. "And whatever happens, happens." 3 weeks later, she'd known. The familiar signs had been absent, replaced by a bone-deep certainty that had made her hands shake as she'd stood at the kitchen window watching Jonas work in the distant field. She'd waited to tell him until after Ellie was in bed, until they were alone in their room and the world was quiet. Then she'd taken his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I think your wish came true," she'd whispered. Jonas had gone very still. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor, but yes, I'm sure." He'd pulled her into his arms with a fierce joy that had taken her breath away. "A baby," he'd breathed. "Our baby. Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." He'd pulled back to look at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You've given me everything, Lydia. A wife, a healed daughter, a home that feels like a home again. And now this. How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," she'd corrected. "The day I stepped off that train and you decided to help a stranger. Best decision I ever made." They told Ellie the next morning, and the little girl's reaction had been pure joy. She jumped up and down, squealing with delight, already planning everything about her future sibling. "Can it be a sister? I want a sister. We can share my room and I'll teach her everything and we'll play with the kittens together and it might be a brother, Jonas had cautioned, but he'd been smiling. Then I'll teach him everything too. Can we name him Jonas if it's a boy? After you, Papa? We'll see. There's plenty of time to decide. As Lydia's pregnancy had progressed through the summer, the ranch had continued to prosper. The chicken business had grown enough that she'd hired one of the neighbor's daughters to help with the egg collecting and sales. The crops had come in better than expected. The cattle had thrived. And the cabin, which had once felt empty and sad, had been filled with laughter and love, and the everyday chaos of a family building a life together. There had been difficult moments, of course, days when Lydia had been sick and exhausted, when Jonas had worried obsessively about losing another wife to childbirth, when Ellie had acted out from the attention shifting away from her. But they'd weathered each challenge together, talking through fears, supporting each other, learning to be a family in all its messy, complicated glory. Mrs. Hartley had visited regularly, bringing advice and supplies and stories about her own childbearing years. Other women from town had stopped by, no longer looking at Lydia with suspicion, but with acceptance. She'd become one of them, a rancher's wife, a mother, a woman who'd proven she could survive Montana and thrive in it. In early October, as the leaves turned gold and the air carried the first hints of winter, Lydia had gone into labor. It had been long and difficult, and there had been moments when Jonas's face had gone pale with fear, memories of Sarah's death clearly haunting him. But Lydia had been strong, stronger than she'd known she could be. And when the midwife had finally placed a squalling, perfect baby boy in her arms, she'd looked up at Jonas with tears streaming down her face. "A son," she'd whispered. "We have a son." Jonas had knelt beside the bed, one hand on Lydia's shoulder, one finger gently touching the baby's tiny fist. "He's perfect. You're perfect. Thank you. Thank you for this gift." They'd named him Thomas, not after the Wardell who'd rejected Lydia, but after Jonas's father who'd homesteaded this land decades ago. Thomas McKenna, born into love and hope and the promise of better days. Ellie had been entranced by her baby brother, insisting on helping with everything despite her occasional jealousy. "He's so small," she'd whispered, holding him for the first time with exaggerated care. "Was I ever this small?" "You were," Jonas had confirmed, "just as small and just as perfect. And now I'm a big sister. That's a very important job." "The most important," Lydia had agreed. As winter settled in again, their second winter together as a family, Lydia had found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she'd been desperate and alone, rejected on a train platform, certain that her life was over. Now she was a wife, a mother twice over, a businesswoman in her own right. She had a home that was truly hers, a husband who loved her, children who brought her joy beyond measure. She had friends and purpose, and a future that stretched out bright and full of possibility. One evening, as she'd stood at the window nursing Thomas while Ellie played at her feet and Jonas worked at the table, she'd felt overwhelmed by gratitude. "What are you thinking about?" Jonas had asked, looking up from the accounts he'd been reviewing. "Just how different everything is from what I expected. How much better." He'd set down his pen and crossed to her, wrapping his arms around both her and the baby. "Any regrets?" "Not a single one." "You?" "My only regret is that I didn't find you sooner, that you had to suffer before you found your way here." "Maybe I needed to suffer," Lydia had said thoughtfully. "Maybe I needed to be broken down so I could be built back up into who I was meant to be, into the person who could be your wife, Ellie's mother, Thomas's mother, into someone strong enough for this life. You were always strong enough, you just didn't know it yet. And you," she'd turned to look at him, "you were always capable of loving again. You just needed someone patient enough to wait for your heart to heal." Jonas had kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that spoke of love and gratitude and forever. From across the room, Ellie had made a gagging sound. "You, kissing! You two are always kissing." "Get used to it," Jonas had called back, making Lydia laugh. "This is what people who love each other do." "Well, when I grow up, I'm never kissing anyone. It's too gross." We'll see about that, Lydia had murmured, exchanging an amused glance with Jonas. Later that night, after both children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Lydia and Jonas had sat together by the fire as had become their habit. These quiet moments, when the day's work was done and they could simply be together, had become Lydia's favorite part of each day. "I've been thinking," Jonas had said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about expanding the chicken operation, building a second coop, maybe getting into ducks as well. There's good money in duck eggs if you can find the right buyers." "That's a big expansion." "You've proven you can handle it, and we've got the capital now. The ranch is doing well enough that we can invest in your business without risking everything." Lydia had felt a warm glow spread through her chest. Jonas believed in her, not just as a wife and mother, but as a businesswoman in her own right. He saw her as a partner in every sense of the word. "I'd like that," she'd said. "Though I'll need help. Maybe we could hire someone." "Already thought of that. Mrs. Cooper's youngest daughter is looking for work. She's a hard worker, knows her way around livestock. I thought maybe you could train her, bring her into the business." "You've really thought this through." "I believe in you, Lydia, in what you're building. This ranch isn't just mine anymore. It's ours. Your chicken business, my cattle, Ellie's future, Thomas's inheritance. We're building a legacy together." She'd leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness that had become her anchor. "I love you, Jonas McKenna, more than I thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too. More every day." They'd sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, listening to the wind outside and the soft sounds of their children sleeping. This was peace. This was contentment. This was the life Lydia had dreamed of without knowing she was dreaming it. The next morning had dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect autumn days when the sky was impossibly blue and the air was crisp without being bitter. Lydia had been hanging laundry when she'd heard a horse approaching and had looked up to see a stranger riding up the path. Her first instinct had been wariness. Memories of Thomas Wardell and his cruelty still lived in the back of her mind. But Jonas had emerged from the barn and greeted the rider with a wave. "Can I help you?" he'd called. The man had dismounted, removing his hat. He'd been young, maybe 25, with an earnest face and nervous energy. "I'm looking for Mrs. McKenna, Mrs. Lydia McKenna." "That's me," Lydia had said, approaching cautiously. "Ma'am, my name is Peter Walsh. I'm Reverend Walsh's nephew. I've just arrived from Philadelphia, and before I left I was asked to find you if I could, to deliver a message." Lydia's heart had begun to pound. A message from whom? "From a Mr. Henry Garrett. He said he knew your mother, that he'd been a friend of your family before things went, well, before things went bad for you." The name had sparked a distant memory. Henry Garrett had been a lawyer who'd done some work for her father back before the drinking had gotten bad. A kind man who'd tried to help when her mother had gotten sick. "What message?" she'd asked, her voice barely audible. Peter had reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a sealed envelope. "He said to tell you that your father's estate finally settled. Apparently there was some property, a small house, that got tied up in legal proceedings after his death. It's been sold, and after all debts were paid, there's money left over. Your inheritance." Lydia had taken the envelope with shaking hands. Inside had been legal documents and a bank draft for $300. A small fortune. "I don't understand," she'd whispered. "My father had nothing. He died with debts. The house was in your mother's name," Peter had explained, "separate from your father's debts. Mr. Garrett fought to keep it out of the creditor's hands, but it took nearly 2 years to sort out. He wanted you to know that your mother had provided for you, even after she was gone." Tears had streamed down Lydia's face. Her mother had found a way to take care of her, even from beyond the grave. Even when Lydia had thought herself completely alone and abandoned, her mother's love had reached out to protect her. Jonas had put his arm around her shoulders, and she'd leaned into his strength. "Thank you for bringing this," Jonas had said to Peter. "Will you stay for a meal? It's a long ride back to town." "I'd be grateful, sir." Over lunch, Peter had shared news from Philadelphia, stories that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Lydia had listened with interest but without longing. That world wasn't hers anymore. This was home, this cabin, this land, these people. After Peter had left, Lydia had stood holding the bank draft, overwhelmed by possibilities. "What will you do with it?" Jonas had asked. "I don't know. It's so much money." "It's your money. You can do whatever you want with it." Lydia had thought for a long moment, then smiled. "I want to expand the chicken operation, like you said. Build that second coop, get the ducks. And I want to put some aside for Ellie and Thomas, for their futures. And maybe—" She'd hesitated. "Maybe we could build a small addition to the cabin. A proper bedroom for Ellie so she doesn't have to share with Thomas as he gets bigger." "You don't have to spend your inheritance on the family. This is my family," she'd interrupted firmly. "This is where I choose to invest. In us. In our future. In the legacy we're building together." Jonas had pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "You're an amazing woman, Lydia McKenna. I'm just a woman who knows where she belongs." Over the following months, they'd done exactly what Lydia had planned. The chicken operation had expanded significantly, with Mrs. Cooper's daughter, Mary, proving to be an excellent addition to the business. The cabin had grown, with a beautiful new room for Ellie that made the little girl feel like a princess. And they'd put money aside for both children, savings that would give them opportunities Jonas and Lydia had never had. The ranch continued to prosper. Their family continued to grow, not just in number, but in love and understanding. And Lydia, who'd once been a rejected bride shivering on a train platform, became known throughout the territory as one of the most successful small business women in Montana. But more than success or money or reputation, what mattered most was the life they'd built. The way Ellie ran to greet Lydia every day, calling her mama without hesitation. The way Thomas smiled when Lydia picked him up, his small hands reaching for her face. The way Jonas looked at her across the dinner table, his eyes full of love and gratitude and wonder that they'd found each other. On their first anniversary, Jonas had given her a gift, a small painting he'd commissioned from a traveling artist. It showed the ranch in winter, the cabin warm and glowing with light, smoke rising from the chimney into a star-filled sky. "This is how I think of us," he'd explained. "A light in the darkness, warmth in the cold. Home." "It's perfect," Lydia had whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "We're perfect, not in the sense of being without flaws, but in the sense of being exactly what we need to be. For each other, for our children, for ourselves." That night, as they'd lain in bed with the painting hanging on the wall where they could see it, Jonas had held her close and whispered, "Thank you for staying, for not giving up when things were hard, for believing in us." "Thank you for seeing me," Lydia had replied, "for seeing past the frightened girl on the platform to the woman I could become, for giving me the chance to become her." "You were always her. You just needed the right place to bloom." And bloom she had. Against all odds, against every expectation, Lydia had found not just survival, but joy. She'd found not just security, but love. She'd found not just a house, but a home. Years later, when Ellie was grown and married with children of her own, when Thomas had taken over running the ranch, when Jonas's hair had gone completely white and Lydia's hands had developed the calluses and strength of a lifetime of work, they would sit on the porch of their expanded cabin and watch the sun set over the mountains. "Do you ever think about that day on the platform?" Jonas would ask. "Sometimes," Lydia would reply, "but not with sadness anymore. Just with gratitude that it happened exactly the way it did. Because if Thomas Wardell had been a kind man, if he'd married me like he promised, I never would have found you. I never would have had this life." Funny how the worst moments can lead to the best ones. "That's the thing about life," Lydia would say, taking his weathered hand in hers. "You never know which moments are blessings in disguise. The trick is being brave enough to stay, to fight, to believe that better days are possible." "You taught me that," Jonas would say. "You taught me that it was okay to hope again, to love again, to live again." We taught each other. And in the golden light of a Montana sunset, with their family gathered around them and decades of love behind them, and whatever time remained stretching out ahead, Jonas and Lydia McKenna would smile at each other with the contentment of two people who'd found exactly what they'd been searching for. Home wasn't a place, they'd learned. Home was the people you chose and who chose you back. Home was showing up every day and doing the work, even when it was hard. Home was forgiveness and growth and laughter through the hard times. Home was this. Always and forever, home was this. The girl who'd been terrified on a frozen platform had become a woman who feared nothing, because she knew that whatever came, she wouldn't face it alone. She had a partner, a family, a legacy of love that would outlast them both. And that, more than any fairy tale ending, was the truest kind of happiness there was.